Calling the April 18th, 2019 Professional Qualifications Committee meeting to order. Mr. Williams, please call the roll.
Raymond Chang.
Here.
Betsy Dougherty.
Here.
Tian Feng. Glenn Gall.
Here.
Pascual Gutierrez.
Here.
Kirk Miller.
Here.
Stephanie Silkwood. And Barry Williams.
So we do have a quorum?
We
correct?
do,
Okay,
yes.
very good. But I'm sure Mr. Feng's in transit and will be here shortly. Going to item B here, now my list, I have, I see no members of the public here yet. That's not to say they won't be arriving, but if they do, we'll provide them with opportunities to address the committee at the appropriate times. And so at this point then I will ask staff to introduce themselves.
Vicki Mayer, Assistant Executive Officer.
Laura Zuniga, Executive Officer.
Marcus Reinhardt, Manager of Examination and Licensing.
Tim Rada, Examination Licensing Analyst.
We see you.
She's our newest addition.
Yes, Ricky Parks, this new CSE analyst.
Very good. Thank you all. Housekeeping information, you may all know that the restrooms are right through the lobby as you go out the door to the right. Lunch will be obviously when it arrives, and we have time for that. If you have your lunch envelopes, if you have not yet given them to Marcus, please do so. Also, today's just advisement that the motions will be read clearly for the record. Motions and seconds will be repeated for the record, and the vote on motions today will be taken by roll call. One additional item, we all have a roster in front of us of the PQ committee. If there's any edits that need to be made to that, please pass them on to Marcus as well. Seeing no members of the public yet present, we'll move on and go to the review of the and possible action for the October 25th, 2018 PQ meeting minutes. Are there any questions, comments, or edits to those minutes? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I so move.
I'll second.
Moved by Mr. Raymond Chang and second by Mr. Barry Williams. Roll call vote, please.
Raymond Chang.
Yes.
Betsy Dougherty.
Yes.
Tian Feng. Glenn Gall.
Yes.
Pascual Gutierrez.
Yes.
Kirk Miller.
Yes.
Stephanie Silkwood.
Yes.
Barry Williams, yes.
Very good. That moves us to agenda item E. And I'm going to shift the order rather than go E1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to, I think, allow us enough time to digest and review these and take information. Since there are two that do not require a motion, I'm going to begin with item number 2 as the first item. Provide licensees the opportunity to submit continuing education documentation online to increase efficiency and license renewal. And I'll ask Mr. Reinhardt to present this item.
This item is among a few items that are assigned to the Professional Qualifications Committee as part of the 2019 to 2021 strategic plan. And this item specifically addresses the development of a means for licensees to document their continuing education in an online manner, the purpose of which is to streamline the process with regard to conducting the audits. So at present, this item is being considered by the legislature. It's a part of our sunset review bill, which is Senate Bill 608. And the legislature is recommending that we formulate regulations for implementation by, please bear with me here for just a moment. back to the actual.
January 1, 2023.
Thank you. January 1, 2023. That would affect how audits are conducted, as well as the means by which they could submit. It also involves the establishment of criteria for continuing education providers. So it ties in with one of the other strategic plan items that is on today's agenda.
Very good. So, as I mentioned, there's no action requested by the committee on this item or objective, but are there any questions for staff on this objective? Mr. Miller?
Did I, Marcus, when I read this, did I understand in there that it's going to be up to the providers of the continuing education to submit results to the board?
Probably not.
It would,
It gives the continuing education provider the option to submit it, so that the licensee still has the ability to submit it on their own, but the CE provider could submit it directly to the board if we wanted to, if they wanted to.
From my point of view, it'd certainly be a lot more efficient if the provider needed to submit the records to the board. And then, of course, the candidate or the licensee could also do that, but it was one of the provisions that we certify you as a provider of continuing education. One of the responsibilities you have is not only give the course to the architect, but also for you to provide the results of that exam to the Board of Architectural Examiners. A good quid pro quo. They have to follow up. I just think that would be a matter of good public policy, and give us a bit more oversight as a board. By way of example, I don't want to say it on the record, but anyway, I'll tell you about the one I took last time. And maybe they shouldn't have been. Anyway, I think it'd be a lot more efficient from the legislature's point of view, and there's some culpability then or responsibility on the provider's part.
These, correct me or please, my understanding on this, Marcus, so we still, the verification of this documentation is still done by audit?
correct.
Okay.
We audit approximately a percentage of the licensees that renew each year.
So, Kurt, in the interest of efficiency, would you see if an individual was audited, then the provider provides that information?
No.
Or does the provider automatically always provide the information?
Automatically.
That's what I think too.
Okay. Now, do you have any reservations about the fact that then your documentation or verification of completion is hanging on the balance of that provider doing what they're supposed to do?
That's why if we have both, we can
Yeah,
check
well,
to verify, or we can submit.
It could be, if the provider was not to do that, that would be grounds for disqualification, being a qualified giver of the courses.
Yeah.
So that would be the penalty against them. But then, what Betsy is saying, then the candidate would also have the option of submitting to themselves, but it may not be necessary for them to do that.
I always check my documentation, I always check my AI documentation, but frequently this might be an AI chapter from California Council who is providing, and I know that right now when they provide continuing education courses for AI membership, they do post it. But maybe that's because we're dealing with California Council in Orange County, which is well staffed, and there might be some smaller who are the delivery, who are unstaffed. That's my only concern, is that potentially, as the candidate, I always ask for them to send me a paper certificate, and I've got a little file in my office, and I hold on for 2 years, and then I call them. But you have to look out for number one, because things do happen.
But I thought these course providers always have to qualify their courses first with the board. So in order for them to qualify,
Do they?
I don't think they do.
I'm not sure
They
they
don't.
do. The AI
They don't?
Yeah,
does.
that's the question.
so the 5 hours is not a qualified course
Right, there's sort of minimum standards that
currently?
have to be met, but the board itself doesn't approve the providers, so the legislature is asking us to approve providers and develop regulations to do that. So if that legislation goes through, that's something the board will have to develop, and so we can factor in like the suggestion about making sure they provide it.
Yeah,
But we
I think it's
did, in
important
the
to
language, when they
yeah,
asked for it to be
qualify.
allowed the provider to submit it, we wanted the flexibility.
Exactly.
So the licensee could still have the opportunity to submit it, so they're not reliant in case something happens. And
Right.
we used to require all CE documentation to come in, and then it was overwhelming in terms of the amount of paperwork, and so the requirement was amended so that we just get the documentation when they're selected for audit. So that's still something for the board to consider if and when we, at some point, we move to a new IT system, and we could take that documentation online, and
Right.
if the provider could just, submit it directly, that would definitely be more manageable.
Sure.
Scott?
Yes, sir.
So Laura, who gives the okay that a course provider is allowed to do it?
No one.
That's a big hole.
Yeah, definitely.
Jim?
So I thought I may ask a question before. Can CAB defer to an entity like AIA said, any class that's certified by AIA will accept it as here. Do we have some kind of
default?
No authority to be able to even empower a professional society. It's not part of the
Yeah, I think it will be so much burden business-wise for us to certify providers. How many providers we know? Maybe 2,000, maybe 5,000, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
it's just operationally impractical.
So we'll
Yeah.
probably come back to this as part of the E1.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll discuss it
That's
But
Further.
part
further.
of
Back to that,
the
yeah.
concept of being able to do it electronically, now that we don't have to do paper anymore, solves the problem of the state not wanting to be in the business of having to dedicate a whole room full of paper
Yeah.
filing. If it all could be filed electronically, AI does the same thing.
Will paper filing still be an option?
Are you talking about for renewals?
It's not
for-
it's not required.
I mean,
Unless you're audited.
If you're audited, will you still be able to submit a hard copy?
Even if we move to a new system, yeah, we would always allow for the paper documentation.
That would be an
Yeah.
option,
Yeah.
because you don't want to be in that business. And there would be no reason for it. I mean, we're all going paperless, so. When I
State's
saw
slower.
this, But, and so then the other question is, does the state have an existing program, maybe even if they're using other agencies, where that platform is available and the architect's board doesn't have to purchase it? Software.
You mean for them to submit the CE documentation?
The software.
The platform
The platform.
Oh,
might
to be able to
exist
submit
with
it.
another department.
So we're looking at like replacing our whole, the both systems we use right now for applicant tracking, all licensing information. So DCA does have a system in place that about half the boards are using. So right now, the board's in the process of what's called business modernization. They're mapping how we do things, and then now we're gonna map how we wanna do things, and then go out and see what system would meet those needs.
And so this would just be one more.
Yeah, it would be one part we would look for in a new
As a
system,
whole.
the ability to submit this online.
Correct.
So when one renews one license, somewhere in the system would be the mandatory continuing education that the provider afforded to you, and it would have our whatever number or name on it, and then that automatically get inputted into the profile of the licensee.
So when we send in our renewal, that record, that's already in there.
Yeah. And it would
So
go
we don't
to,
have to ask the question.
right, it automatically go to our profile. And then it would say renewed on such and such a date, here was a continuing education that allowed you to be renewed. If they could get that on the map, that would be great.
Yeah.
Come back on my earlier comment. Each time I just simply go take AI approved 5 hours. They have this 5 hours.
Right.
Instead of I looking for who is more qualified or competent, I just all these years I just wait for AI fly come out. Say, oh, now we offer this 1 day, 5 years, then I go take it. So I have been doing this already.
So for all of you who don't know this, Monterey Design Conference happens in October of every year. My birthday happens to be late October, so I always have to renew my license at the end of the month. So at the beginning of the month, you get to be in Monterey. It's an amazing conference, and if you're willing to get up at 6:30 in the morning and be in your seat at 7 a.m., this one obviously isn't willing to do that, but on both days, they have 2 back-to-back programs, and by the time you walk out the door, you have 6 hours.
Oh.
And it costs this much more if you already paid to be at the conference. And they are really stellar programs. So anyway, I'm just
Good deal.
not to pitch, but that type of opportunity is available to every licensed architect in California.
The last comment that I'll put on this is that if we had provider documentation filed in our folders or whatever, it probably will go a long way in eliminating the #1 citation problem we have,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Which is falsified completion of continuing education.
It definitely can, and that's definitely something that I and my team are looking at, is the ability for either a provider or the licensee themselves to be able to upload documentation to their own record that we can then access and streamline the process. Once we move through the business modernization process into the desired configuration, then at that point we'll definitely be looking at server systems that can provide us what we're seeking.
Okay, so since the committee is not taking action on this, has staff received sufficient feedback from the committee?
You don't need an official recommendation.
No, I don't think so at this time.
Yeah, I think we're
But our comments are noted and would be passed on to the board or whoever gets considered.
correct.
Okay, very good.
That's a good one.
Let's move on to I'm going to move to item E3 as our second item, which is conduct an occupational analysis of the profession to reflect current practice. Again, no action is requested of the committee. And staff will address questions of the committee members that they may have regarding this objective, and I will ask Mr. Reinhardt to present this item.
This item is another of the strategic plan objectives assigned to the committee, and every 5 to 7 years, it is recommended that a licensing entity which provides an examination conduct an occupational analysis of the profession to determine what the minimum requirements are in order to perform at a minimally competent level. The last time this was done was in 2014, and so we're beginning to initiate the process at this time. NCARB prepared its practice analysis back in 2012, and when we did our most recent occupational analysis in 2014, that served as the basis for examining the national side. NCARB is currently in the process of working on the development of doing another practice analysis, which it's anticipated will start shortly after its fiscal year in October. We've spoken with the Office of Professional Examination Services, OPES, and based upon their advice, we are looking to wait until after NCARB has conducted and finished its practice analysis sometime in mid to late 2020, at which point we'll begin working on our occupational analysis. The reason for this is because the comparison is made in a linkage study and also a review of the national exam to how NCARB is testing, that since the test plan hasn't changed at this time with NCARB, it's advisable we wait until they have completed it and we have a fresh practice analysis on which to use. So while ordinarily we do these within 5 to 7 years, we're still within the acceptable range for conducting an occupational analysis, and we anticipate that after NCARB has completed its practice analysis next year, that by potentially mid-2021, we can have the occupational analysis complete, and the next phase, which is the national review and linkage analysis, the linkage study, can be conducted. So ideally, we are looking at a test plan change out at approximately 2022.
Any questions on this objective by the committee?
So
Okay,
even at
we'll
tw-
start with Mr. We'll go
Betsy, you go
counterclockwise.
first.
Everybody raises
Well,
their
we'll go
hand.
counterclockwise. How about that? So we'll start with Mr.
Yeah, let's start with Glenn.
Glenn.
I've got a question as to, the occupational analysis is typically sent out to as many architects as we can to try to get good information back about what we think the state of practice is. Along with this, will we be querying people who rely on architects, like building officials, like large clients, like small clients, affiliated professions, engineering, because frankly, I think we all have a great opinion of ourselves and our practice, but a lot of people rely on our practice, and our perception might be a little bit skewed. And to get that sort of insight in going out with that practice analysis, I think would be something advisable, just so we're not a little too focused on what we think practice should be, but what people in the public need practice to be.
That's correct. There will be a series of focus groups conducted. We've already discussed some of the groundwork for that with OPES as to what type. Well, we're going to start with similar focus groups that we had for the last occupational analysis. We're also aware that there was a desire for us to look at clients of various sizes. That came out of the last discussions on occupational analyses that we conducted. So we will definitely be looking to expand that. We'll be following, of course, the advice of our examination specialist, but that's definitely a must that we're going to have the focus groups. And they'll conduct the focus groups, the interviews, the one-on-one interviews as well, similar to what they did in 2014.
Correct me, to Glenn's point, correct me if I'm mistaken or wrong, Marcus, but if I remember back in 2012 when I was with NCARB and we did this analysis back then, they had actually, that was the template that they used. They had attorneys and building officials and contractors and everybody, all those various focus groups contribute to it so that we got and heard what their opinions were. So.
Yes, and we did the same thing. We molded,
used,
yeah.
right?
Mhm, that's exactly it. We at the time with Doug, when he was the EO, that's exactly what we did. We looked at how NCARB did theirs and decided to mold our own approach. We worked with OPES, and they thought that was great. So they created the various focus groups. So that's our intent, to repeat that for the next
Great. Mr. Miller.
I was going to say that when we discussed continuing education requirements, that could feed into what we're discussing
That's
right
the
now.
basis of it, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, jumping ahead to that, I'd like to, like us and the board, to dust off the study that was done back in, I don't know what it was, 20 years ago, when we decided not to induce mandatory continuing education for architects, because, I'll get into that when we get to that topic.
On that topic, got it.
But I like what Marcus is saying, is we need to build upon what NCARB has done, because we've always looked with, I don't want to say what kind of an eye on what NCARB does, but their approach is a little different than ours. And what we did when we were looking at mandatory continuing education, I think Vicki, the budget was at least $100,000, if not more, because we had all the focus groups and studies, and we had a survey done, and we had this massive report done. And we'll get into that too, but something like that, because that gets back into what in our supplemental exam, what we have in our mandatory continuing education. So it's a big topic, and the study really has to be done correctly, and dusting off something that was done 20 years ago will really give a good baseline for that, despite what decision the board made at that time.
Yes, point taken. Down, I think there's
Okay, real quick, I just want to double check that the date requirement. If you look at 2014 for 7 years, and the projection is around 2022, are we going to be okay on that 7-year requirement?
Yes, because 22 is when we'd have the new CSE plan, the new exam plan. So the actual analysis would occur in 2020, in the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year.
Okay.
So it's still within that appropriate window. It's close, but in discussions with OPES, they indicated that it's still fine.
Okay.
They were just concerned that if we did it now, it would be too early and we would be comparing to the same plan, and that's not how they want to approach it. They really do want to see a new plan from NCARB before they
Sure,
they do
it makes
that.
sense. They just want to make sure that we're not missing that 7-year window.
Yeah.
Correct.
But also, not only what NCARB is doing, but they want to see something that we're doing. And where that may have a little different slant than what NCARB is doing.
Correct.
Okay, good, thanks.
I think just following up on that I was also kind of looking at the date saying what you're from the AI ending or starting, ending in end of 2020, and whether we have enough time. But I guess also starting ahead to where I think what Kirk's saying is that we're creating some of our ideas at the same time that they're working on theirs, so that when they are done, we have something to kind of balance it back and forth with, and that we're not waiting till after they're done to start ours.
We do have to wait until they've completed theirs, according to OPES, because we need a finished product from NCARB before we can
start.
do the comparisons.
Yeah,
that's why the need for the push on waiting. The original plan was to begin conducting it in this upcoming fiscal year, the 1920 fiscal year. But given that NCARB would not have the completed practice analysis, it would be essentially a waste of money because we would be comparing to the same data that we had before. It wouldn't tell us what new information. And then what would happen is NCARB would release its practice analysis after that, at which time we would have to go back and redo the project, redo the comparison. So it's more efficient and cost effective for us, according to OPES, that we wait until they finish by late next year, and it's still within that fiscal year is still within that range that's considered a best practice.
Yeah, because I've been involved. It sounds like Pasquale has. So it sounds like we still have people that are involved from our members of our board, except that are part of the NCARB that still has some idea of what's happening. Is that correct?
Yes, I know, yeah. We have a couple of members that are on the current committees, which is not a bad committee to get on if you can get the gig.
So, question, then I explain why I ask the question. Either you or Marcus or Pascal may know how NCARB conducts that study. Are they reach out to the members directly, the architects directly, or they work with the jurisdictions of the selected states? And the reason I ask questions is if they selected the states to work together, maybe we want to consider be part of it.
Okay. My understanding from NCARB is they do reach out directly to architects, but they also take input from jurisdictions, and we've provided input before to NCARB, but it's primarily conducted by them directly with the architects. They do a process similar to what we do, where they're going to survey the practicing architects, and I think last time they had like 15,000 architects that they reached out to get input from.
I assume they pick up representative or they select from all 50 states. I don't know.
I'm not sure exactly. I could research that for you. I know that they do some objective process for selection, but I'm not sure the details.
If I understand correctly what they do, if you subscribe to the NCARB newsletters, which provides you the information as to what's going on at NCARB, you receive an invitation to provide your input on the survey.
So
you
maybe
have that
not
opportunity.
be very targeted representation of all the jurisdictions.
Yeah, I don't know how they reach out to all those other constituencies, like the contractors and the attorneys and all that. But I know the architects, if you're in the system, you will receive an invitation.
That's just one strategy.
Yeah.
They're
just one
probably
strategy.
talking right now about exactly how they might.
Exactly.
We don't have anything to say about it.
Okay. Stephanie,
Yes.
anything?
Oh, no, I don't.
No, that's it?
I do. First of all, while we're waiting for NCARB's 2020 release, can't we be together having these types of conversations to design our own process? We don't have to do the study, but we can look at what we did last time, question whether or not there might be some new opportunities, which I have a list of, in addition to communicating with NCARB, regulatory agencies, OSHPA, DSA, AIA, also as a representative, since I kind of wear that hat here at the table, schools of architecture. So I think that now is the time for us, because we have the time, to look at that process and maybe reconsider it or consider new opportunities, because we do have a dramatically changing profession. And it seems like the exam moved from 4 to 5 just in the last 2 years. And we have a brand new CSE from what it was traditionally. So we've had 2 major changes in the, and of course I have 14 people in my office right now who are in the pipeline, so I'm their AXP advisor, so we have these conversations all of the time. And whatever comes out of this 2020 and then takes the next level is going to impact that process again. And one of the things that I hear from my candidates is that the CSE is a dramatically different exam than the ARE, different language, different priorities, different approach, different philosophy, to the point where they get into this cadence with these portions of the ARE, and then of course they sit on their heels and wait for authorization to test the CSE, and many of these really bright kids walk in there and they're surprised at how different it is, and they realize that they haven't been studying properly, and got some really bright kids who are not passing the first time, and that's some of the feedback that I'm getting. But so I think it's interesting for us to look contextually at what this means to incoming licensed, new young licensed people, and it also, and I know that our job is to be able to facilitate the licensing process, but we have a bigger job than that, and that is for architects to be that smartest person at the table, to be at the table, not to be left behind by all of these other professional influences, CMPM, design, build, bridging, all of these different delivery methods where we have to become strategic partners with all of the other members of the design and construction industry. And it is changing fast. And I suppose our merger is also pretty indicative of how our practitioners' environments are changing.
Whose merger? It's owned by your firm?
Didn't I give you my card? I guess you did.
No.
It's late to the table.
Very
I
good.
thought you'd be all over.
Congratulations.
So we've gone from a 40-person studio to 1,200 people worldwide. That has been a really interesting ride.
Yes.
And it's almost a year, and I feel like a kid again, learning and doing all new kinds of things. And it's pretty interesting to change that perspective, but also to understand that we still serve the individual sole proprietor, all the way up to the mega firms that are now on an international stage. So we're just California fit. Anyway, it's getting more complicated, and I think we just want to make sure that we engage those people who can provide that perspective, so that we not only get it right for today, because you know darn well if we start in 2020, let's get the plan, which can get tweaked in terms of just the process, and then 2 years later we're going to be out of date. So I think particularly the regulatory stuff,
Betsy,
especially environmental stuff.
Those are all points well taken, and I think you'll have an opportunity to expound on your thoughts on the next item. I've kind of orchestrated a way where we can talk about that.
Follow-up
Mr. Miller?
question. Pursuant to Tian's point, if I understand correctly, that when NCARB is doing their survey, they send it out to their members. So the question I have is, AIA represents about 50% of registered architects. Does anyone know off the top of their head what percentage of registered architects are members of NCARB?
Certificate holders or just subscribers?
Certificate holders who would get the newsletter and
Yeah,
be
they
able
would
to-
have, if they remember very correctly.
Countrywide, just California.
Countrywide.
Countrywide.
My point being is that
I'm sorry, you don't, just one slide, correct?
Yeah.
You don't have to be a certificate holder to receive that information or that invitation.
well, that's the question. Who do they send the invitation out to? If it's in the newsletter, it's not scientific.
Yeah, it goes to those who are in the system that have subscribed to the NCARB bulletins.
Right, and they were probably a member of NCARB at some time in the past if they made it a mailing list.
Not
My
necessarily.
point being is that a psychometrician may look at this askew and say, well, you know, NCARB members or past members who get the newsletter and can partake in the survey. The survey has to be mailed to them. They have to put in a request for it, whatever that's done.
It's online.
It may represent far less than 50% of the architect population of the country. And I would speculate that it
Oh,
does.
you get a 10% response, it's considered. a
Well, yes,
reasonable
yes.
response.
The point being is that the results are already skewed because who gets a certificate from NCARB? Typically someone who wants to practice in another state. And you have to have an NCARB certificate to get reciprocity. So that's immediately skews who is going to be doing that survey. They're larger, they're more successful, they do work across state lines, as opposed to people who don't see, I don't know what, I dropped my NCARB certificate years ago, people that don't have that mindset. So that's a question mark for you, Marcus. What percentage of architects are certificate holders for NCARB, and what percentage of architects get their newsletter? What is the pool?
The percentage in the state or in the
No,
nation?
countrywide. This is a nationwide
So
survey.
just my guess, because I did read, happened to be the number. I remember somewhat, little slightly less than 50% of the AIA member, which is 80,000 now. So I assume around 40,000.
So it's,
certificate holders.
so your recollection is
I
half of the AIA
understand.
members belong to NCARB. And I'm sure it's, unless it's changed, historically, only half of registered architects were members of the AIA. So you're looking at 25% of architects. So,
There's going to be members of NCARB who are not members of AI.
I want to
well,
thank you.
yeah, that was,
Thank you for kind of daylighting what my reasons behind my
Yes.
question is. I just want to make sure that the California is a big state, and we practice in a very rigorous way. I mean, our regulations. So we want to make sure that NCARB survey is well, California's perspective is well represented. That's why I was asking if they happen to collaborating, let's say, dozen of states on this task when they want volunteers, and California can be one of your volunteer organizations, if that is the process.
Yeah, there is a process that is considered a standard process for conducting an occupational analysis, and that's because what you're doing is you're holding licensure over an individual to practice a profession, so it has to be justified from the very beginning. They do send out the invitations to practicing architects, and it is largely dependent on who responds. It's the same situation for us. We have 19,000 plus email addresses, and so we send it out to as many of those as are still valid and that are willing to respond. We received about 1,500. Now there's information in there of the type of businesses that individuals are running or participating in, and so they do look to make sure it's not skewed in any particular way. That's a part of that validation process with the occupational analysis. So we can add focus groups and we can provide input as far as what focus groups we would like to see, but in order to protect the validity of the process, we are restricted in a lot of ways from defining what that process is. It has to be the same process used for our exam that would be used for other exams. And that doesn't preclude focus groups, but that's how you establish the validity that you're using a defensible approach for determining whether or not that what you're asking is reflective of what is needed in the profession. Just the very nature of how occupational analyses are done, and I've learned a lot from our psychometricians working with them the past several years. When what we're looking for is that minimum competency, and what they primarily look for is what did new individuals, and that is a part of the exam development process that's ongoing. They're looking for individuals who are newly licensed to provide them information of what is necessary as someone who's newly licensed to be tested upon. And in the occupational analysis, they broaden that not just to practitioners who've been practicing for many years or decades, but also for those who have just become recently licensed. And so they attempt to, throughout the process, to create a balance, to assure that it's not skewing in one direction or another, because there again, that could potentially compromise the integrity of the analysis. So we can definitely bring recommended focus groups to the attention of OPES when it serves, so we get closer to when we're going to start developing the occupational analysis.
I got a series of questions, Pascal, following up.
Yes, sir.
So Marcus, if I understand what you're saying, when we're doing our survey in California, we use our 19,000 email addresses as a pool. And some of those are from out of state, but they're practicing, have a license to practice in California.
Mm-hmm.
But I understood you to say earlier that NCARBs is restricted to people who have a connection with NCARB. They're either registered or they used to be registered, so they still get the newsletter. So the question is, how could they send it out to all nationwide registered architects unless they were to get data from each of the 50 states? And so the question is, do they pool all registered architects or just those architects with a connection to NCARB?
So the internet says that it went out, the last one went out to over 80,000 architects, interns, and educators. 7,800 responses were included in the final data analysis. So I think if it's going out to 80,000 people, it must be much farther reaching than just NCARB members, right? It's probably circulated through the universities, through the AIA.
But then to really get a validation from a psychometrician's point of view, they would have to know what percent of the respondents were from just NCARB carriers or from architects as a whole. So, I mean, it seems to me there's some background work that needs to be done. And this is all the more reason for us to do our own survey, because we'll be sending out to all registered architects within the state of California, registered within the state.
Right.
So our pool is not only to AIA members, or not only to NCARB members. So it would seem to me that from a psychometrician point of view, our survey is going to be more, quote, quote, accurate. And that leads to my next. So please, if you could somehow get answers to those questions, that would give us some background for our own survey and use some background for our own survey.
So, if I may clarify, you're looking for, at the next meeting, an update on how NCARB does their process?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we can definitely look into that. That information is in their report, so we can check it out.
So just for your information, I was really into this years ago, and one time it was after the NCARB study that was done, I want to say in the range of 2000 or 1999, whatever. I did a really thorough study of the gap between education, the educator's point of view and the practitioner's point of view, and it was just remarkable. And you all like to look at stuff like that. It had beautiful graphs and so forth and so on. But anyway, that's just sort of background. The other question I have is, the results of a survey are often skewed by how the questions are asked. So 2 points. We can see the results of the NCARB survey. Can we see the questions that they ask? And our psychometricians might be interested in looking at the questions the way they're framed, because the way a question is framed sometimes predetermines what the answers are going to be. Statistics, and damn lies. And then the second question is, Marcus, when you're starting to prepare our study with the results of the input from focus groups and so forth and so on, would the PQ committee and CAB be able to look at the questions themselves before the survey goes up?
Well, the
question.
questions will be online, won't they?
Well, if they're sending out, if they're sending them out to
Yeah,
the
so we'd be able to look at
individuals,
it. But we might not necessarily get that because, well, you can send it out to 19,000. You said you sent out 19,000, you had 1,500 responses. So yeah, maybe we'll all get it in the mail. You're right. Okay, I'll have to withdraw that. But would we have a chance to look at the questions before they go up? Is the question.
Are you talking about our
talking about
survey
Yes.
or the NCARB survey?
The board doesn't review.
The board doesn't review, and I don't, I'd have to talk to our psychometrician to see if that's a part of the industry practice to review the questions.
I haven't seen other boards do that.
Yeah, but yeah, well, we're not allowed to make comments off the record, but I always have a concern when professions give their fate over to psychometricians, as opposed to the profession itself having a chance to review things and so forth and so on, because psychometricians have their own, their objective point of view, but objective is not necessarily objective.
Means and methods, yeah.
Big topic now.
Good.
Okay.
So again, on this particular topic, the committee is not being asked to take any action. But we did ask questions and we provided feedback, which I know, even if you didn't take a really copious notes there, we are on a webcast, so we do have a recording.
Just a sidebar question.
Yes, sir.
I had to use the restroom before I came to the meeting. It was closed downstairs, so I went to the second floor, and I noticed professional studies something or other down the hall. Are the psychometricians directly above us?
Yeah, right over there.
Close at hand. Great.
Can I make one more suggestion? I remember the last time this was done, at least when we were reviewing the results, we had OPES here and they explained the process. It'd be interesting to dig up the notes from those meetings to see what kind of questions we had at that point in time that might inform how you might want to shift the process.
Excellent.
So I don't believe this committee will meet again until next year. Is that correct?
We don't have a date scheduled, but there's
Targeting July of next year?
We meet every year,
Yeah,
right?
it can sort of meet at
Once a year,
but
yeah.
at your whatever
Yeah.
the committee would like.
So I guess what I'm interested in hearing is how do we move forward from this point to where we want to be with the PQ?
It's 6 months since our last meeting, more or less, October, end of October.
Any thoughts on that? Sam?
Well, my suggestion was to start designing the process now, while we're waiting for NCARB.
Would we go to the board, Laura, and suggest that the board consider delegating that request or authority to the PQ to start that or initiate that? How do we get to the next one?
So the next step you want is to begin laying the groundwork for the occupational analysis and how it's done. And I mean, that's traditionally just done between staff and OPES. I don't think that the board gets involved in that. So I think if we can have feedback come from the committee members through Marcus, who's the main contact on it, and working with OPES, and then perhaps at the next meeting we can have OPES come if we would like another presentation from them on what their methods are. And the committee can make suggestions as well at that point as to how they would like to have different types of input or different types of surveys done.
Yeah.
So I just want to clarify, yeah, we can have another meeting to discuss the issues. But what is, when you, Betsy, use words very strong, in my view, to lay the groundwork, to design the process. We have a process, right?
Correct.
Our role is to review and comment or update. Is that more accurate? Instead of we want to redesign the process. This group is not task to design process. I
Well, my
guess.
suggestion was that it's a different world, and what we did 5 years ago is
We
not
can
necessarily.
look at the
the right thing
existing
to do
process and a comment, and our comment could be very significant, or could be,
That's the
right,
foundation,
shape the way.
that's how we start.
So then maybe what we do at this point, since we're not taking action on it, is that as part of our commentary back to staff, is that we request that the next time the PQ committee meets, that this topic of the framework of the PQ be on the agenda.
Yes, it will be. So I like planning ahead. So I've already scoped out July of next year for the next meeting, and with good reason. Since we can't conduct the occupational analysis, so we can't really get the groundwork started because we don't have a contract with OPES. And staff aren't able to get that going until OPES is ready to move forward on the process. That is tentatively scheduled for 2020, for the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, in alignment with what NCARB is doing. So at that point, I was projecting we would just have the contract in place. They would start doing the work probably in the latter part of 2020, and we could meet and get some up-to-date input to feed to OPES for the process. But again, the process, in order to be psychometrically defensible, is consistent among professions. And so OPES follows that for all that process for all the professions. But definitely we can provide input on different focus groups that the committee has requested that we include. So we can definitely do that.
Okay, good. So it's just, I'm sorry, another question.
Question, Marcus, and this opens up a whole other can of worms. You said what other professions do. One of the definitions of a profession is that there is agreed upon body of knowledge within that profession. Engineers have a body of knowledge, doctors have a body of knowledge, lawyers have a body of knowledge that's agreed upon. Auto mechanics, blah, 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 blah. There's no within architecture, there is no agreement on what the body of knowledge is. There's no agreement on what the body of knowledge of the profession of architecture is. So we're an outlier in that respect. So does what other professions do work for architects? Because, as Betsy said, things are changing so rapidly. There's no agreement on what the body of knowledge for architects is. I mean, you got to pass the exam, you got to do this, this, and this, and this. But so that's something for you all to think about deeply. And the schools of architecture within the state of California, not one of them has in their mission statement, at least this goes back several years, I don't think they've changed, not one of them in their mission statement has to educate or train architects. And so even the process for certifying schools of architecture, you can do almost anything. There's no set, there's a variety of points of views of what you need to provide to get accredited as a school of architecture. So that begs a bigger question, should we be looking at not necessarily what other professions do? So that's a question. I certainly don't have an answer for that question, but it is a question. And someone like Jerry Brown, years and years ago, made the argument that raised the question, is architecture really a profession? Because it doesn't have agreed upon body of knowledge. Anyway, I'll just...
Okay, so we'll kind of wrap that up on that point. I just will counter just briefly that I believe there is a body of knowledge that's been established to at least establish minimum competency for licensure, which is the body of knowledge which is identified in the ARE as well as in the AXP.
That's an excellent point.
So we do have some body of knowledge there that he wants to aspire to. It's 5 of 11, so I would think this is probably an opportune time to take a bio break. But prepare your minds for the next topic, which is item E1. And the committee is asked to discuss the objective and provide the board a recommendation regarding contemporary professionally relevant CE topics and to reflect that reflected the continually evolving nature of practice. The way I'd like to handle this is with 2 rounds. The first round will be a roundtable committee member listing of suggested topics that would be relevant to progressive practice. And round 2 will be a round table committee member discussion on the items and thoughts of the framework for a continuing education program. So, having said that, let's all be back at 11:05, and we'll start with item E1.
That is going to be an interesting conversation.
Now, to frame our conversation and this whole topic about revamping or revisiting our continuing education requirements, I'd like to read a quote by Mr. Eric Hoffer, and would be delighted if staff use this as our preamble to the board, as our rationale for continuing education and revisiting what we have currently in place. And that quote reads, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." So, let's begin our roundtable listing from our committee members on topics that would be relevant to a progressive practice. And let's just go down the roll call list. Mr. Williams?
Okay.
So that would make Mr. Chang first up. And if you think you need more time to collect your thoughts, we'll go past you and go to the next person and come back.
Pass me first.
Do you mind if I make a comment before you get started?
Please.
So I was just going to say that I know this is one of the board's strategic objectives, but just to keep in mind that the board doesn't have the ability to set the continuing education requirements, that we will need to go to the legislature. So that's something to keep in mind.
How much detail does the legislature need?
They would have to authorize the board to require additional continuing education topics.
But would any point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are in the continuing education, or is it more of a blanket authority subject to regulation by?
It varies, yeah. So different boards do it different ways.
Because there's got to be flexibility, because as Betsy's saying, it would change from time to time, and wouldn't have to go back to the legislature. Well, maybe every sunset review we would look at it.
Mr. Chang, the floor is yours. Any topics that you feel would be reflective of continuing evolving practice?
Well, just to kick off my personal feeling on this, the 5 hours on accessibility alone, I think it may be an overkill on one subject. I think we should look at other opportunities to get the maximum benefit out of these continuing education topics. I don't know how we roll into this 5 hours in accessibility law only.
It was legislative.
I understand.
Basically attorneys, yeah.
Right. So we just, for, I don't know how long has it been going on now, for many, many years, we just keep spending 100% effort on accessibility. And even though it has been evolving, but I just sat through one 3 weeks ago, and we spent almost like 3 hours looking at all types of funny signs, and we're just making comments on those, and because everything else hadn't changed that much, except the person that taught that class basically said, well, look at this sign, what do you think? So we spent a lot of time on that, qualifying for the 5 hours, but yet I think this hour could have been better spent on something else. So that's the first feeling on that.
Do you have any topics that you think should be inclusive in the continuing education requirements beyond accessibility?
Yeah, I think lead information is important. The green movement, building material. How do you learn to be more sensitive about sustainability? That's something that we can look at. In all due respect to the architecture profession, we are losing edge to construction managers, program managers, to people that are not trained as an architect in those positions that manage design profession and manage construction profession, manage the entire project. So I think architects should be better trained in their continuing education in that area, so that they are, when they go to that field, they are really truly the leader in that table with 25 people. I think it's important that architects understand that importance. So that's stuff that you don't learn in school, and you learn it in practice, but not every firm will give you that opportunity. So somehow, even after their license, if they can pick up that opportunity on continuing education to pick up in those areas, that would be something I'd like to see.
Okay, very good. Before we go to Ms. Doherty, I think we're all in agreement that the time has come for us to revisit our continuing education requirements. So in keeping with our charge, let's see if we can narrow our thoughts to providing suggested relevant topics for the board's consideration. Okay. Let's see.
For starters, I think we don't mess with those 5 hours. It would be misinterpreted that somehow we felt it wasn't important, or that we were neglecting our duties, because if you'll remember, we had to fight as architects to be considered experts with the advent of the CASP certification. That's where all of this came from, remember. So I really think that needs to stay in place. To effectively, the message to the state is that we see this is important. We want to retain that responsibility, and architects are qualified. And I really just see two others. Ray, you mentioned sustainability. I would avoid the reference to LEED, because that is a private, U.S. Green Building Council, its own thing. But in terms of sustainability, and being a tree hugger from Berkeley in the 60s that I am, I was brokenhearted when AIA dropped the requirement for sustainability from their LUs. So it's not that you can't do it, but it's now not a required section. So there's just sort of the big HSW, health, safety, and welfare. But I would like to think that we look at health, safety, and welfare and sustainability. Talking about management, that's a very difficult subject to quantify. And if you want to fight on your hands with the Building Industry Association, with construction managers, I don't think that the California Architects Board is really prepared for that, nor should they be dragged into the mud. So I do believe that if CAB did include that as part of the certification, we might be fighting over it with some of our industry partners. And I think my feeling is, of course, now I'm a big firm, so I can say this, that there is the ability within the firms to be doing that and just go after your market share in a free marketplace, just like everybody else. We let it go because of our liability history, and our insurers told us that we shouldn't be doing that. Big mistake. We shouldn't be listening to some of this peripherals. But I think if we really focus on health, safety, and welfare and sustainability, in my view, that would be something that everybody would understand and appreciate. And it could be done probably with no more than 12 LUs over 2 years or something like that, to distribute between the pre-existing ADA, health, safety, and welfare, which is a big topic, and specifically some of those LUs being targeted to sustainability. California is way ahead of the rest of the country, as we all know, being a bellwether state with Cal Green and Title 24. So the question is, that's my world. All of us are working in public work. We have to remember that sole proprietor who's going to be licensed in California, and what will enhance their ability to practice through this requirement. So these just seem to be two topics that would resonate with everybody, no matter what you're doing, what type of building project, what your role is, if you're working for an agency, if you're working as a private practitioner, if you're an educator, whatever would be something that would have value.
Thank you, Vince. Tian.
Yes, I want to thank the chair to put this in a very structured perspective. I think the conversation is very important. We may not land anywhere as the process had Laura just mentioned, but I think our view should be shared by the state. Okay, so with that said, two topics in my mind. One is the resiliency against climate change. The reason I want to put this topic forward is industry, society, and whole globe move towards a value of more towards equity. Equity in all aspects, economics and physical constraints, and of our built environment, and our ability to live and enjoy our life at where we choose. So that's fundamentally relevant to architecture practice. The person who shapes the built environment, the person should have the most knowledge shaped in such a way that brings a long-term benefit to their occupant. Okay, so that's one. Two is, it is also relevant, as I mentioned, architect design buildings. If without these constraints, where the form of architecture came from, it becomes just a making up, right? No, you want responding to your problems and concerns, and therefore your architecture taking shape. So it's very relevant to our profession. And the third one is also practical. And if you're talking, when I come to the States, I remember the subject I eager to learn the most is how this country, which is 1985, to address the building code for seismic design. And it's the only country that, to me, is so systematic that to tackle this very low probability issue in a very systematic way. And after 35 years, everybody agrees, no complaint, to design building with this kind of ability to withstand earthquake. And knowing they may not even occur during the lifetime of your structure, but you're still invested in, and your building department's looking at it, and your contractor knows how to do the nailing. So it is also practical. So I think the resiliency is very important. Two is based on the same value, and I have mentioned the accessibility must change. Accessibility, it's such a low denominator. Ask for architects to be educated again and again because it is a code requirement. You cannot even get a building permit if you do not meet the requirement. So the building official is educating you on every project. We don't need 5 hours of every 2 or 3 years. So instead, we need have architects understand the universal design concept. Again, this very concept based on the equity, the modern society. We want to design something that is not favorable only for a few groups, whether you're physically able or unable or disabled, but we want to design something that supports all users, whether enjoys by all users, whether you are able, you're a mother with a stroller, and you're on a wheelchair or you're blind, because for too long I have addressed these issues by simply comply with accessibility does not meet need of all user groups. When the blind community think they may need tactile paths, for example, the wheelchair users feel so inconvenient in them maneuvering in certain space because their wheels get caught. So the universal design is a solution, and universal design also is very practical to implement. If you fly as airlines, you stay international brand hotels, many details already in very universal. You don't need the language. You see the signs, you push the air conditioning, you know where the fan is. There's no English, no Chinese, nothing, just a simple symbol. So these kind of things are already in place, and architects need to step in. And there are many other topics, but I saved this for other members.
Don't you think it would be easy just to kind of rebrand the concept so it's a little more holistic?
Thank you for that, Jen, on the topics. Staying on the topics, suggested relevant topics. Glenn.
I appreciate everybody's take of what we all need to do as architects and what we need to learn, but I'm looking a little bit more at California practice issues. I always consider myself a consumer of architectural services from architects because I work in a building department. That said, the level of practice generally is so low for what's generally seen as a high-level practice project type, healthcare, that I'm I'm really, what can I say? We're somehow failing and missing something in the way we want to educate, but to license. As the economy's boomed and everything's growing and going, we've gotten a lot of out-of-state practitioners who come to the state, they get a California cover, and don't know where to begin with basic things like Title 24 knowledge. I'll ask in-state practitioners what's Title 24, and they go to the Energy Code. Title 24 is the building code in this state, and it happens to change every 3 years. Yet, the only things we focus on are the 3-year changes within the disability realm. There's a lot bigger changes that go on in this state. In terms of general education that's state-specific, I think Title 24 knowledge or education ongoing would be appropriate. And the other thing that I was looking at was I initially thought ethics or ethical practice. That's a little bit, I think, too broad and probably not the right term to apply to it, but really focusing on the Practice Act, rules of professional conduct. I've been involved with some case reviews with the board, and the way some people approach practice, they don't seem to know what the rules of professional conduct are. And at times they need to be reminded, and sadly, with some of the case reviews, they need to be reminded multiple times because of multiple complaints. I think refreshers in what we all need to know and how we need to practice would be appropriate because it's a basic requirement for licensure. You're supposed to practice within these bounds. And I don't want to be wholly negative, but the thing is too, I think that sort of knowledge in the California context would be beneficial to all of us ongoing as a reminder, because we don't always employ all the knowledge or all the skills that we all have had to show experience in or knowledge in on a day-to-day basis. Our practices have become specialized in most instances, and we forget about the general practitioners that are more general and need to know all those other elements that they don't pick up and use every day. But that's it for me.
Thank you. Chris, I'm up. Great comments. I was hoping we would start migrating in this direction. The only thing that I'll say is that with regards to the accessibility, I don't know that maintaining the 5 hours that we have now is necessarily the way to go. I could see a reduction of that, and I'll reserve my comments for the framework on the next roundtable. To Glenn's point, for those of you that don't know, I no longer work for HMC. I now am with a construction management company overseeing, actually managing architects. And I'm almost aghast at what I'm seeing when I see their deliverables. I'm thinking, you expect us to build this? There's a major gap there of how you put projects, how you put buildings together and campuses together. So I agree that there should be some sort of, and I think that would fall under the category of health, safety, and welfare, where we have, and maybe even easier to say that I think relevant topics would be those categories of the ARE as well as the AXP, because they pretty much cover those technical delivery types of experiences and knowledge and I like the word resiliency, because we're beyond sustainability now. We've got to do more than that because of the damage that we've incurred on the environment. And I love the rebranding of accessibility to universal design, because I think that's really more inspiring for architects. And I think that one of the reasons that we have our leading issue of violations in California is the falsified reports on continuing education, because I think architects are not inspired to do that. It's something that they're just trying to get around if they can. And so to introduce a continuing education requirements that are more inspiring and relevant to evolving practice, I think is in our best interest going down the road. So, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. I was gently chided because at the last meeting I pointed out the 3 E's. It could actually be the 4 E's. education, experience, examination, and enforcement, I'd now like to mention 4 C's. And these 4 C's were derived from the study we did over 20 years ago with regard to mandatory continuing education. And what we determined, the 4 weaknesses of the profession were codes and regulations, lack of knowledge of codes and regulations. Second one is construction, lack of knowledge of construction, what it takes to put a building together, how contractors work. The third one was construction documents. Architects did not know how to put together a set of construction documents. The fourth one to me was surprising because it was communication. And I thought, oh, communication, architects, a large percentage of architects are dyslexic and therefore not good writers, spelling mistakes and so forth. But actually included in that lack of communication was graphic communication, which may get back to construction documents. But even looking at requests for information and so forth and so on, you have to do a sketch. So that was very interesting. So those are the 4 fundamental weaknesses in the profession of architecture. And from what the comments have been made previously, they all sort of relate back. Why aren't architects better managers or better leaders? Because they're lacking those 4 fundamental skills. And so yes, you don't become a good manager by taking a management course. You become a good manager by knowing the subject material that you're managing. So what I would urge us to do is to pull up the study, wherever it is in the archives, and look at what that report said. And that report, at the end of the day, said mandatory contingency is not necessary. That's because some of the politics was involved at that time. And the AIA didn't really want you to do it, perhaps for the reasons that Betsy was saying. But I think we need to look at those 4 basic elements, because those are 4 basic elements that are not really deep in the curriculum of learning.
And we can let you, again, expound on that a little bit more in our next
Absolutely.
round, which is the framework of it.
So the 4 C's, and then what I would put out there and what we need to address.
Perfect. Okay, Stephanie.
So this might echo what a lot of people have said already, but I think that the point of the license is to develop minimal competence to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, right? So I feel our continuing education requirement should do that. And after initial licensure, every architect goes on a different path with that minimal competence, but we become experts at certain things. And I know that we can't be experts at everything, so I would recommend we broaden the continuing education requirements to cover the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and that would include many of the things we've talked about. And it would be a loose definition that allows people to become experts at the things they choose to develop their career on, so that collectively, when we're practicing within the areas of expertise that we've chosen, we will, as a group, protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public in different ways as individuals. But I think that allows us to accomplish much more as the practice has become so much more complicated. We can't ask everybody to develop expertise in every bucket. So I just think, I appreciate the definition of health, safety, and welfare of the public in terms of continuing education requirements that the AIA has developed. I like that it's broad. I don't know if that's necessarily enforceable with this group, but I think that it allows us to allow people to gain that expertise.
Great, good comments. Thank you, Stephanie. And again, I'm totally in agreement with Stephanie. Going beyond health, safety, and welfare is imperative, I believe, to have the California architect relevant to the people they serve. As Glenn's probably well aware, there are topics out there like evidence-based design, which is very prominent in healthcare. But let's go to Mr. Barry Williams.
All right. Lots been said that I totally agree with, but I think that early on, one of the comments was that the field is so big, and having in the last 4 or 5 years gone from a principal in a 60-person firm to a sole proprietor is a really different field, completely different. And so I think what Stephanie is saying is something that I look at is this idea that we have almost a menu of things that we have an opportunity to look at. I mean, I can't real broad, but there's certain things that we see that are important, that are relevant to the type of practice that we have, that we want to then get an extended education. I think it should be mandatory. I think that we need to do that. There's many courses I'd taken. I'm no longer with a part of the AIA, but I had taken courses, and some of them were really amazingly wonderful. And I think that idea that, you know, a lot of times we do get kind of caught in our own work and doing things, that we may not extend our education. But I think having them, I hate to say mandatory, that we have to do so many hours of different things is important. At the same time, I think it's very important that we get past this 5 hours that we have on that we're doing right now for accessibility, because I think in the beginning there was a lot of there was a reason why it was there. The changes that have happened over the last 10 years are very minimal. And as said before, you know, that is a code requirement, it's really in there. But I think the things on resilient architecture, the things that we've seen with climate change that's happened here in California, learning more about that. I'm doing a small little thing out in the country in San Luis Obispo right now, just looking at kind of the green codes, the resiliency I need now in a small structure that I'd never dealt with before. So I think that having that opportunity to have different paths that we could go down that is reflective of what our interests are and what our practice is would be important.
Very good. At the end of this topic, we will have to come up with a motion that we're going to send to the board. So maybe these two roundtables, we break down into two straw votes, and then we come up with a motion at the end and then vote on that motion. So on the roundtable one, on providing relevant topics, let's take a straw vote if we're in agreement on everything we've heard, allowing staff to summarize and compile all the comments as the relevant topics that we're sending to the board. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take a straw vote. That we're in agreement on the topics.
Okay, agreement on topics. Raymond Chang.
You mean pick the best topic that we...
No. Just an agreement that we've voiced and we've covered.
Absolutely, yeah.
The topics that need to be
I think we heard
in this
a lot of different good input, and if we can come to an agreement on that, and then we can send it to the board and let them look at it as a second round.
Okay.
For them to act on it.
So, I'm not sure I understand the
So-
motion either. So I'm just sort of thinking
We're taking a straw vote. We're taking a straw vote.
But I can pick out at least 6 topics that were brought up. So I'm not sure what our motion is.
Well, I think what we're doing, we haven't developed the motion yet. The motion comes at the end.
Well, no, the one we're voting on right now.
What we're voting on now, have we voiced all the additional topic, or all the topics that we would want included or to be considered in a continuing education program?
I think so.
Summarize that, yeah.
And then we might want to tag on, or other ones that may come up in our next round of discussion.
Correct.
Just to make that as a
Correct.
friendly
We can come
amendment.
back and add more if we want.
Yeah.
Are
So-
you asking if we agree on the topics or that we've uncovered all the potential topics?
Both.
Okay.
Have
So do I have 2 votes?
we touched on the topics that need to be considered, or have we left any out that maybe we have to add at this point? Okay.
Yeah,
So-
that's fair enough.
Okay.
Straw was, I said
Straw
yes.
vote. Raymond Chang. Betsy Doherty?
Yes.
Tien?
Yes.
Glenn?
Yes.
Pasquale?
Yes.
Kirk?
Yes.
Stephanie?
Yes.
And
With
yes.
Okay, very good. So that will be a part of our motion when we get to the end here. So let's go with round 2. Lunch is not here yet, correct? Just the chips are? Okay, so let's go into round 2, and this is one that we'll go around the table again, and the committee is asked to discuss the objective, and this is where we discuss the objective. And what I would like to do is hear committee's thoughts on the framework for continuing education requirements. We know that there's frameworks out there. AIA has a framework, 18 hours, continuing education 12, which was be health, safety, and welfare, or essentially health, safety, and welfare representing 60%. USGBC has some criterion. So this is an opportunity for us to voice our thoughts on what we think the framework should be for continuing education for the California architects. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's shake it up this time, and let's go from the bottom up on the roll call list. So that would.
So
be
this
you
is
first.
me. That's me. So the framework.
Do we have 12 units, 10 units, 18 units?
It's
How
hard,
many
yeah,
sites of the
hard to say because of what the content of what the programs are, but I think that, somewhere in the range of probably 10 to 15 units, somewhere in there. I think that there should be some units that would be required for everyone, that we see as general units that all architects should know about, that a certain percentage of those would be ones that we would be mandatory that you take those. And then I think we should have the flexibility to pick from other units that are more towards our own particular practice.
Okay. 10 to 15 units, a percentage of those being mandatory, and a percentage, oh no, you didn't say a percentage of those being health, safety, and welfare, I'm sorry.
Well, no, but I think that, you could even do maybe three things, where you have a certain mandatory ones that might deal with the ethics and the things that we deal with.
Mhm.
You might have a certain percentage that are health, safety, welfare, and then you might have another, so if you had like 5, 5, and 5, and the 5 would be the electives to whatever.
Okay, very good. Very good. Stephanie, your thoughts?
I agree with the recommended number of hours that Barry suggested, and I also agree with having some that are set criteria and some that are more flexible. Finding out what that balance is might be difficult, because that would require us to agree on what are the most important things for every practitioner to know. One of the priorities, I think, would be making sure that our system has the flexibility that those who are pursuing continuing education for other professional organizations could use hours to fill both buckets, as opposed to compounding more and more hours on those who are already doing continuing education. There was one other point I wanted to add. Oh, I think just to add to our discussion from the previous section, I feel it's debatable whether the board should be enforcing the relevance of architects in the profession. I think we should leave that for professional organizations. I don't know if it is in the board's best interest to advance the profession as opposed to protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So that's something that could be debatable when selecting the criteria. And I think that's all I would add for now.
Okay. Kurt?
Agree with what's being said. I think the number of hours is up for further discussion. It's a question whether it's the same as the AIA or it's a little addition to. But as categories that would be mandatory, I would see the 4 C's that I mentioned earlier, plus energy sustainability, plus resiliency covering ADA. So that's 6 right there. And then, as mentioned also, maybe we need something on ethics and practice methods. AIA, as an organization, does have a code of ethics and standard of practice, but that only applies to AIA members, not to the other half of the profession that are not members of the AIA. So maybe we, as a state board, need to bring that part of it into all architects.
Can you repeat your 4 C's again?
Codes, construction, as a construction, like builders, construction documents, and communication. And then add to that energy, resiliency, or resilient design, or universal design for ADA, and then anything with regards to ethics and standard of practice. And then, in addition to that, as pursuant to what both of you said, is there should be a flexible category in there that is beyond the minimum standards we're trying to establish that could be applied to your particular area of interest or expertise. And a comment on that, and Betsy can either disagree or back me up on this, as I understand, the topic of specialties has come up for discussion many, many times within the American Institute of Architects. And there are two very distinct points of view on that. One distinct point of view is, yes, AIA should certify specialties as American Medical Association certifies specialties for doctors. And the other thought on this is, no, architects are universal. They know less and less about more and more, as opposed to engineers who know more and more about less and less. So, if you become certified as a specialist, then that means you can't compete in something you know the methods for, but you're not an expert. So those are the two schools of thought. So I don't think we want to get into us certifying specialties, but at least have part of our mandatory continuing education that that you are allowed to do something outside and beyond the minimum established standard of practice.
Good. I was just signaling Tim if you could bring in his marker so we can maybe start to jot some of our thoughts down before they get away from us. Okay. But what I heard Kurt was the 5 C's.
4 C's.
4 C's. I'm sorry. 4 C's.
Energy,
sustainability, resiliency, universal design,
and then ethics and.
ethics, and those could fall in the electives, if you will, right? Or we
Well,
could use
that's a
specialties.
question. That's a question for the board to decide.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
So-
and I'd also like to say, pursuant to Betsy's point about architecture defending leaders and management and so forth, again, I'll reiterate it. If the profession learns the 4 C's, then when they're sitting at the table with their client, with the engineers, with the contractors, they can be the lead person at that. But right now, the lead person is more often than not the contracting side. And that's why a lot of architects become master architects, and they become working for construction managers. And they bring that area of expertise to the table. Again, the AIA, you're right, Betsy, they backed away from that because of liability issues. So we need to fill some of that gap that the architectural profession needs to handle on its own.
Okay. You have that? Okay, good. So we'll go to next. We're going to me.
You.
I'm going to let this ride because I'm really enjoying what I'm hearing, and I think we're going in the right direction. So I'm going to maybe turn myself into a scribe over here.
Facilitator.
So that would be
Glenn.
Glenn. Let's hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm sort of walking the fence with everything that I'm hearing put out. I like the idea of the flexibility of having almost an optional category where you can sort of choose your flavor of what sort of continuing education that you'd like. And then I'm also hearing things about making for better practice at large. And where I'm on the fence about is sort of that discussion about AIA and promotion of the profession versus the board and regulation of the profession. And I'm not sure where that line is when we sit here and discuss this issue. Because I'm an AIA member and I'm a member of this committee on the board. And I don't know how much we should delve into the AIA side of promoting the profession. That said, what should state agencies do? They need to make for a very baseline common point so I know as a consumer what I'm getting when I have a licensed member of this profession. But then again, when you're talking about continuing education, we don't exist just within that absolute minimal level of practice realm. So I do think that an optional sort of category of education attainment that's given over to continuing education requirement is appropriate. Health, safety, and welfare is always something that we need to continue to focus on, I think, in terms of our practices, no matter whether you're practicing as a sole practitioner or you're in one of the bigs. It's always an absolute necessity for protection of the public. And I like the idea of having mandatory categories, whether you have maybe a quality multiplier on the time that you spend relative to the category. If it's health, safety, and welfare, maybe it's 2 times. If it's the optional, maybe it's a 1-time sort of multiplier in terms of accruing however many credits you need. I don't even know if that's a matter of time, but it might be a matter of subject that gets qualified as qualifying for your total continuing education. That said, I'm listening to all this stuff, and it's going fast and furious in my mind. How would we actually do this? And what would we put on the board in terms of who are those people that are able to provide this sort of education? Is it a golf junket, or is it really something that we'd all be enlightened by in terms of going through this training or education? And I guess that's left to be further discussed, because it's a really big item. I know it's necessary. I got another 5 hours of ADA training or access training just the other day, and for me that was focused on healthcare. So I sort of ticked multiple things, and frankly I benefited from that training in my day-to-day, but as well as my accessibility requirement. There's a lot more things out there, I think, that are of that sort of categorization that we could all benefit from if it was structured well and put out well as an architect needing continuing education. If we could have those, I don't know, groupings of things as to what the qualifiers are for how you achieve this stuff, it might be very good for all of us. And that's it for me again.
Okay, thank you.
Tia.
Yes. I was thinking have 5 subjects equal weight, but only one of which is mandatory for any registrant, any architect to fulfill that. And then how do we select the 5 subjects? I see several criteria. Okay, one is meet the intent of protect the public safety, health, safety, and well-being. Okay, so that's one. Any subject has to be directly address that. 2 is the relevance to architectural practice. Right, the doctors also has huge to do with public safety, health, and well-being, but they practice in medicine, but we're practicing architecture. So the subject have to be directly relevant to architecture practice. And the third one, I just urge, we already, this is not the favorite topic, I understand, from the prior governor, and he may want to abolish the whole thing. So the criteria is don't put additional burdens. For example, don't make them take 2 classes. I mean, why? We're just 1 class, right? But the inclusiveness is also very important. People practice in different focuses. You cannot have an interior-focused architect thinking about climate resiliency every day, because the building envelope is not his scope. So that's why that the 5 or 6 or 4 subjects make them available subject to each registrant's pick. So that's my view.
Okay, good, thank you. That's it.
It's encouraging for me to hear that I think we're all pretty much on the same page. So if any message goes forward, I think that's the message. I would concur with roughly the number of units we're talking about, 10 to 15. I don't know why 12 popped into my mind. But something that's not greatly different from AI, because AI does require health, safety, and welfare, and the rest is a mixed bag that we're choosing. And I think that's part of what we're talking about, is providing that opportunity within the required LUs. I also 100% agree with Stephanie that we should be able to fill both buckets, because, as we said, we don't want this to be onerous to architects in California. We want this to be something that's achievable, that they can afford, that is something that they have many options in terms of how to access this program. But sort of rolling the sustainability, resiliency, climate into one, absolutely. We're already leaders in that area, and this is a survival issue. I think we all agree on that. I also very much like the concept of the ADA accessibility being rebranded as universal design, so it's more holistic. And honestly, if those two items, and health, safety, and welfare, which can be interpreted in any number of ways, are maybe 3 areas that have a prescriptive number of hours to them, and the rest is at the individual's option, might respond to everything that everyone has said here. And as a specific recommendation to the board might be something that we could want to.
Okay, good deal. Raymond.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I agree with most everything I heard. I worry about increasing the number of, I think your unit, you really mean hours. So it's the only way you can quantify the time to put in. We may have a problem getting even through legislature if you want to increase it to like 15, 18 hours. For all along, if you're going to do it with the renewal, the license renewal cycle, you're talking about 2 years. 5 hours every 2 years, in my mind, is about right for people that are practicing. It's just a matter of how do you make the most out of that 5 hours. If you allow, let's say, narrow it down to about, let's say, 5 topics or area of study, and maintain that 5-hour requirement. I mean, I wouldn't go anything more than 8 to 10 hours. No, if you go more than that, it's going to be a problem. You already gone through you qualify them for the minimum part of knowledge that they need to be licensed, and then you require this because things are changing. You want to make sure that they keep up with the latest, and so that 5 hour to a maximum 10 hours within maybe a simplified 5 topics, no more than 5, maybe even 4 areas that are health, life, and safety related in those areas. Then any licensee can easily pick the area they want. If you want to make it mandatory for, let's say that ADA accessibility is 2 hours out of the 5, that's fine. But the options will be for them to pick other areas to fulfill the 5 hours requirement out of different areas. I think that would probably go easier than doing what AIA is already doing, which is promoting the profession. How do we make better architects? It's not the job of the California Architects Board to make better architects. We already did that in the beginning when they come in, before you get a certificate. But we definitely want them to be aware of the latest and the greatest change that is protecting the general public and consumers. That is our job. I think it's important that never lose sight on that part.
Good deal. Perfect. So we've had some great comments. It is, I think that stops playing with me, 11:54, which puts us at about the 12 o'clock hour. Why don't we grab lunch, start eating that, and look up at the board. This is kind of generally what we talked about. We talked about some topics being code, construction documents, communication, universal design, sustainability or resiliency. We talked about the categories of mandatory health, safety, and welfare, and also electives, having that as an opportunity for specialty so that firms can focus on what they do as architects to be relevant to those that they serve. We talked about number of hours in the 2-year timeline being 10 hours, 15 hours, and 5 hours. Okay? So let's kind of let that sort of marinate a little bit, grab our lunches, and then we'll pick up and see if we can start narrowing this down.
Very quick question. I don't know the answer to this because I'm in AIA Emeritus for a number of years. What are the minimum number of hours per year for AIA membership? 18 per year?
Yeah. 18 per year and 12 of them which have to be health, safety, and welfare.
Yeah, and the sustainability was removed from the requirement a few years ago.
But it falls under HSW.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
As does ethics.
I guess it was in bold.
So let's grab lunch. Give us 10 minutes to grab our lunch, sit back down. We'll have a working lunch, and let's start to narrow this down.
I wanted to point out the salads are still coming.
The salads are still coming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the sandwiches are
Those that are
there,
getting
salads are
salads
still
can-
being prepared.
Those that are getting salads can watch the Sandwich Monsters.
So it's not like a big
Are we
salad.
done?
Everybody
Okay.
has to stand there.
Next meeting.
I have a comment on that.
Yes, please.
We look at what other professions are doing for the number of hours that they're doing education. Might be a good benchmark for what's palatable for our,
Other professions, you mean? Okay.
yes.
So
Are there comparable professions that are
Right.
doing this?
I don't know that we're going to have the ability to do that in our motion today. That we're
Not
setting
today,
up.
but as food thought.
Research.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
As a base, could we get, what you're talking about, in the state of California, what are the hours for other professions or trades that are subject to continuing education? And what is the standard in other states for licensure? Like New York currently doesn't have any standards. Well, what states do, and I know some of them just replicate the AIA.
Do we
That would
have,
be a good piece of research.
But Marcus, that would be an excellent piece of research. Gets the base.
So what we could do to move forward is we could say, we could earmark maybe 10 hours over the renewable cycle and have as an asterisk to that a comparable analysis for other professions.
That's what I think, yeah.
And other states.
Yeah.
So
Different things we want people, want the staff to kind of look at to help either.
So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so how close are we to saying that it's 10 hours? We think
Well,
that's a reasonable number?
It might be. It depends on, like, if we went for, 5 topics, one of your choice, or, what the sources are of attaining or achieving this
Okay.
continuing education, because a lot of it, there's extreme cost involved, whereas others, you could either pay or get it through a free venue, like the way it is with Access training now. There's online National ADA Center. You can get all 5 hours for free, or you can, buck up and pay $150 for the day. So I think that needs to be consideration. Not that that's a lot of money, but then again, it's somewhat of a burden that if you don't have a source that you can get it very readily,
Not everyone
you need to
works
consider
for-
it.
Not everyone works for a large firm that pays for
That's
everything.
exactly it.
Right, yeah.
Exactly right.
Pascal, may I, and I think that we not recommend a specific number of hours at this time, but we lay out what data we need to determine the amount of hours. And that will, maybe after we do all those others, look at everything involved, then a natural number of hours will fall out of it compared to the IA, compared to other states, compared to other professions. We have all that data, and then we can see what the extremes are and what we need to cover, and then the number of hours, 10 a year, may fall out as the natural answer.
So if we do that versus making a decision today and earmarking a number of hours subject to comparative analysis with other professions, Laura, if we simply do not prescribe or list the number of hours as a recommendation, what does that do for our board? What does that do to our board? Do they just say, okay, well, see you guys next year? We need to have some more.
No, I think the board could take that and they could make a recommendation if they want. Definitely something to keep in mind is that certainly the board has to go to the legislature to get approval for this, and whether the legislature chooses to prescribe it or the board gets the authority to set in regulations, if the legislature agrees to either of those scenarios, the board's going to have to demonstrate the need for this. So are there complaints that justify a need, like that show an area maybe that the board needs to consider as a topic? Has there been an increase in the number of complaints, and maybe you would look at that as a way to look at the topics, look at the number of hours you're talking about requiring. So those are things the board could take into consideration.
The analogy, if we give a number of hours, that is a prescriptive standard. What we can do is give a performance standard. We need to achieve this, this, and this, and from that will follow the number of hours it takes to get it. So we're not ready yet to give prescriptive, we just want to give performance.
Okay.
Are we comfortable as a group setting a minimum and a maximum range?
We don't have enough data yet to know
I
that.
think a range is This is just a recommendation.
It's just a we could make a recommendation on minimum and maximum, which is going to be determined by a comparative analysis with other boards. So that way, at least we take something to the board and say, this is where we're at right now.
Yeah.
Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
Marcus?
NCARB a few years ago did some research into this and asked the jurisdictions to let them know how many hours they required, because if you recall, they changed their model for continuing education to be consistent. I think they found, and don't quote me on this, but I believe they found between 12 and 15 hours was the average for the
2 years?
states.
Per year?
For renewals, and I think renewals can vary from jurisdiction to another. So I think Texas is, for an example, one that does it every year. I could be wrong about that, but that was the last information I had. So I just wanted to let the committee know that NCARB does have some numbers out there, so we can take a look at that and see what they say. We've done some research in this ourselves, so I can look and see how old that data that we have is in-house. And surely we can go ahead and try and update it if it needs that. I will say that from our experiences, staff encountered that when it comes to asking other jurisdictions, other architectural boards, what they do for continuing ed, there are surprisingly a number of states that are very tight-lipped about it. Particularly if you start being too probative and asking them, compliance rates and whatnot. That was part of the research that we had done for a letter that we submitted to the legislature back in December. So I believe we revised that data around that time, but I can check and I can clearly have some information for the next meeting.
Okay. So are we comfortable then saying that our recommendation on the number of hours would be a number for minimum, a number for maximum, subject to comparative data on collateral and CE requirements? That sound fair?
I'm comfortable with
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's come up with a minimum and a maximum. What are our thoughts? Minimum 5?
I say
that.
minimum
Five, 'cause
five.
we're five right now, yeah. So
Right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That should be an easy one.
And the maximum?
AIA requirements.
No.
You think that-
That's a maximum.
Does anybody else feel that it should be 8?
But are you talking, that's like 18 per year you're talking?
We're talking about a 2-year life
36.
cycle.
So 36 for over a 2-year cycle.
Yeah, it's.
That's a lot.
But it's interesting to
That's
see
way
what
too
law,
much.
in the state of California, what lawyers require, what doctors require, what real estate brokers require.
Yeah, it's going to be subject to comparative
Yeah, exactly.
data. But we're talking about a 2-year timeline because that's a renewal cycle. So Kirk has proposed 36 hours. Any other numbers come up?
I would say,
Let's go
I
around the
would
table.
reframe that,
Yes.
rather than, 36 hours with parentheses, same as AIA, so people know why it's there.
Okay.
Why would our
That could become a
standards be any
comparative-
lower than?
That could come up in our
Yeah.
data research. Glenn, number of hours? Max?
I'm not with a maximum number of hours. It really depends on the quality of the education that you're seeking or requiring. And there may be an allowance for, like, I was suggesting you have a qualifier on what subjects you're being educated in. And that wouldn't necessarily be a time factor. So I don't have a good number.
Okay. Raymond?
no more than 10.
10?
Five minimum.
So we have 10, we have 36.
I'm kind of more like around 15. I think that number 36 would be scary for people, personally.
So your number is?
I'm 15. I'm
15?
15. I'll do
10, 15, 36?
12, I can be swayed to 15. I agree with that. 12 sounds nice because we've got 12 months in a year, so you have to do a half-hour continuing education every 6 months.
there you go.
Betsy?
Because
I like 12.
12?
But I'd put a range from 10 to 12 would probably.
Okay, so how many like 36?
It's a maximum subject to
It's a
data,
max,
so.
subject to data, yeah, collateral. How many like 15?
Oh, I'm being agreeable, and now no one's agreeing.
Oh, asked me to go to 12, so.
I think
I mean,
this is
we
an
can switch.
academic exercise, and I think a recommendation of a range is everything.
How many like 10?
10 to 12.
Well, we
Yeah,
have
yeah.
12 up there.
Yeah.
So how many for 10?
10, 12, 15, the difference is not.
Yeah, I really don't know what we're doing.
Splitting hairs.
And how many for 12?
I like, well,
So that's,
I revote 12.
okay, so on a max, we could say on a maximum, how about 5 is a minimum, maximum 10 to 12? That sound fair?
That's fair. Yeah, okay. That's good.
Subject to comparative data on collateral CE requirements.
And so what do we come up with as max?
10 to 12,
Every 2 years,
yes.
5 to 6 a year. When I was registered in Alberta, I think we were at 12 or 15 years. So, I mean, I'm not sure how we do it, but I would like to record my respectful dissent to having such a low maximum. If it's a range, why not go for something that we have a standard, a professional standard processed by the profession itself, or the representative of the profession. How can we be any lower than that as our maximum?
The only thing is that the intent is different. AIA want to improve the profession versus this board regulate the profession. It's different. You can continue to educate yourself to be a better architect, but it's not the job of this board
To shape practice.
yeah, that's right. Unless you have enough evidence that there's been complaints on code requirement, on accessibility, on whatever. It's a total different reason.
Yeah, I
for
would flip
this.
that around and say that our standards should be higher.
Okay, Kurt.
But anyway,
You're
that's,
going to be you're going to be impacting the young people who are getting licensed. Our licensure rate is going to go down as a result of this is too burdensome. Those kids don't have, you know that they're graduating with $150,000 worth of debt. And they're making $20-some an hour on their first job. This has got to be achievable for the young people coming into our profession. It cannot be onerous, it cannot stand in the way of licensure, and yet to be able to help to raise the bar and
Right.
support for everybody else.
a valid point, a valid
You know, I
point.
don't pick up the tab.
Yeah, no, a valid
Just like you
point.
would just throw it
Perhaps,
away.
since this is
Throw it
meant for a
out.
continuing education, should there be a phase-in period? Because theoretically, when you get licensed, you're on top of your game. How long does it take? Well, theoretically, I said.
When you get licensed, you're minimally competent.
yeah, deer in
Well-
the headlights.
So hearing the committee, what I've done here, is I'm saying, with regards to the number of hours, we have minimum 5, maximum 10 to 12. Both numbers are subject to comparative data on collateral CE requirements and consideration of performance criteria. Okay. Does that work for you, Glenn?
Yes.
Okay. Does that work for
You can want
everybody?
any-
Yes. You want to take a straw vote?
One thing I'd like to also point out is that the board, its mandate to check the minimum competency. So just pointing that out so that when considering the number of hours, it would be connected to what is minimally required to keep them competent and maintain a license as opposed necessarily to professional development.
Like AA is looking, the job of the association is to elevate the profession and raise the standard, which is not the job of the licensing board.
Exactly.
All right. So, I think maybe we're okay at this point with that recommendation. I don't know that we necessarily have to go have a discussion and prescribe or make recommendation on how many mandatory, how many electives. I don't think we have to make a decision on topics. We've already voiced all of those. It's a separate consideration for the board. So staff can compile that list of topics that we provided. Those list of topics, as we understand better what our collateral CE requirements are and consideration of performance criteria, we can then start to narrow down those topics once we have that research under our belt.
Sure.
Does everybody agree?
Yes.
Agree that one. The one thing I think on looking at the increasing hours, and also looking at improving the architect, protecting the health, safety, welfare of people, that we can, in that saying that what we want to do is within that bracket of health, safety, welfare topics, we are increasing our hours, which will, as we describe this to them, which would include universal design, resilient, such and such, that it's all within that is a way of kind of help to sell this thing.
So can we say then that these, wherever we fall with the minimum and the maximum, that the minimum and maximum hours be compiled from health, safety, and welfare and specialty electives?
How about universal design?
Well, that would fall.
Is
in
that health, safety, and welfare?
Not necessarily.
No.
Depends upon how you define it.
Well, I think keeping it broad allows us to define it
That's right.
how we want to, right? And it
Right.
allows it to evolve instead of having the same conversation in 10 years.
Yeah.
But the question is, will it meet the criteria
Right.
of the lawsuit that put us in these
That's
positions in
my
the first place?
concern, yes.
And I do believe we need to ask that question, because it may be mandated, we may not have that discretion.
So, are we good then to be here and not go beyond this today?
I think we'll leave it broad. We'll
Along with our
probably
list
say
of topics
instead of identifying it now.
voiced?
I will leave it at that.
We good here?
Instead of
And then I would-
identifying what topic.
I would recommend that an assessment is done of how the providers are going to be,
Reporting.
Yeah.
right.
I think it's a good one.
It should be
That's a
part of the
big
game.
part of it.
They really should.
So part of it
have
should be
some sort of
provider-
standards for those providers.
Provider qualifications?
Correct.
Well, then they also have the responsibility for reporting.
For reporting it.
Yeah, go back to the first.
I think that's important.
But does the board have the
Yeah, can the board
ability
receive that?
to receive it or enforce it or?
If the board started taking provider credits from 22,000 architects, what would you do with that?
So if the board had to approve providers, we don't have the resources to do that. So it would increase the fees that licensees would pay, probably at renewal, and then we would have to use that money to provide additional staff. So if we looked instead at setting maybe more specific criteria in the regulation or in statute and then the providers sort of self-certify that they meet them, then it's less work on the board staff, which doesn't mean though that someone couldn't file a complaint or the board couldn't look into the fact that maybe a provider isn't qualified, doesn't meet those standards, and then we could still,
Or whether
disapprove.
posted.
Right,
Correct.
and then we could disapprove the CE.
And then Barry has a
A
thought.
question for you, and this is a penalty against small providers, but we're used to, as architects, construction items that you specify in a construction site need to be certified by somebody. And to get that approval from that body, you need to pay a fee to get your product approved. So would it not make sense that, and again, it's the penalty against the small providers, that to get your program certified as being a certified continuing education course, you need to pay a fee, which offsets the cost
Yes.
of the professional
You're right.
qualification in your CAB to provide, to give you that.
Yes, the providers could provide, we could charge the fee for the providers to approve them, and so it would probably be higher per provider than if you spread it out amongst the licensees, but that would certainly be a way we could do it to bring in the resources.
Is there another way to do it to relieve burden upon CAB? If we were to think of providers being AIA qualified providers?
That was going to be my comment.
They've already done it all. They have the database. They have all the
And
criteria.
at our board meeting, he said he'd be interested in working with us on that. I can't think of his name. Who's the AIA?
Mark
Mark,
Costano?
Mark, yeah.
That might be one pathway, right?
Could be one.
One path.
As far as qualifying the providers, so that the CAB doesn't get in the business of qualifying providers.
Well, right now, is it up to the licensee to determine if their course is meeting the requirements? So you could have the same thing. If you do an AIA CEU, it's more likely that it's already been vetted enough
Right.
that, then CAB doesn't have to specifically say that all AIA courses are approved, but the licensee would have a certain level of confidence in it.
What is the criteria? Who certifies AIA?
That's what I was going to ask.
There is a whole staff member that does that.
Okay, so there's,
I was on a
You
committee.
do have
I
to
did
be
it.
certified.
It's
Yes.
We as a firm certified.
a lot of work.
and there could be other things too, like USGS and things like that might have, that also have courses that, things like that, that we could look at those courses and say, these meet the criteria, not everything out of the AI, not everything, but these are the ones that we feel meet the criteria that you can pick from.
Now you have internal staff adding that to the vote.
Yeah.
So could we say approved providers from collaborative organizations?
Sure.
Yeah.
You could recommend providers from collaborative organizations versus saying that they are approved, right? Because you want to still keep the burden on the licensee instead of the board.
And I think like at least what the legislature looks at is if we were to recommend AIA would be an approved provider, is that they don't like to name a particular entity in statute or
Right.
and then it's also providing a benefit to AIA because we
Right.
are requiring licensees to take this. AIA then has this
They have a
captive
gateway,
audience of
yeah,
people. and
exactly.
and it makes
You're referring all these 20,000 architects to go to them
Yeah.
to get the class, to get the lecture and get the hours in order to renew your license. That would be a big fight on that. It won't work. Other providers would challenge the fact that why do you certify AIA courses are qualified, mine is not.
There has to be another.
You got to have alternate ways to do it. This is going to be a tough.
And a lot of these people are vendors, so they're selling.
Exactly.
Now it's as a business and
So,
marketing decision.
I like the idea of charging them to qualify themselves, so they pay for the services for the board to say, based on what you presented, we look at what you're doing. If you qualify, you need to send in the qualification, reporting, and all of that, but you pay the fee. I mean, I can see that. Everything, anybody can do it.
But then that fee gets passed on to the people taking the courses. So now you've got the certified courses are really expensive, which is a problem we already have with
That's exactly why we have to be careful about like requiring 18 hours per year. It's hard enough for an architect to survive nowadays for the young people, and you try to do that, you're basically closing the door again. You just keep making it smaller and smaller and closing the door. The legislature hate that. It will never work. It won't fly. So we have to be careful.
Marcus?
If I could suggest to the committee, the board describes what it requires in order to receive a license. I think we could use similar language for what it would take to be a provider. For instance, X number of years of experience providing training on very specific, right now it's rather general. We could perhaps, the committee could perhaps clarify what that must be, and if they provide, like candidates do, a certified document, like a form that we provide where it indicates they're certifying, they have this experience, who the provider is, what the course curricula is. Essentially, we just have a few words in there that says it must meet these criteria, and it doesn't distinguish between who. It doesn't matter whether you're with AIA or a private person. If you've got that experience, or your CASP, or just throwing some ideas out there for the committee's consideration.
I have a question for you, but I want to go to Vicki first.
I kind of came in a little late. I just wanted to clarify, maybe Laura could clarify this for me, but was the legislative proposal to just set the criteria for the providers or then actually approve them? I thought it was just to set the criteria. And then my other concern is whatever you might come up with, we got to be able to justify it. So, you can't just throw some things
pull
together.
something out of the air, right?
Pull some things out of the air.
The legislation that's being proposed now just says the board shall promulgate regulations to establish qualifications for course and course providers. But that's also focused on the existing requirement we have. So I think, the committee recommends this to the board adopts it, and we'll still have to go to the legislature to get authority for it.
So right now, it's just the criteria for being a
Yes.
provider, not actually having the authority to approve those providers.
Right.
So
It's sort of open-ended.
And that's what
So why would it be
our qualifications are now for providers on the accessibility.
It's kind of more basic
What
than
kind of
that in
language
the
do we have?
existing
Yeah.
law.
Because I'm wondering if
That'd
we're
be pretty
walking
nice.
over a well-traveled road. And if we just simply go on with
What we're
criteria
doing
we
now?
have now.
It's very general.
Yeah.
Which is
Knowledge,
okay.
it's knowledge and experience of state and federal laws regarding access. It lists specific, I don't know.
Yeah,
the
coursework
exact-
provided pursuant to this requirement shall be presented by trainers or educators with knowledge and expertise in the requirements,
Is that good
which
enough?
is
That's
disability
it. That's
access
what they have
requirements.
That's good enough?
Yeah. it's-
Sounds good enough to me.
That's what they do now.
I think it's
If
hard,
I might add.
it's hard for the licensees to define what's considered an expertise or that
Right.
instructor has knowledge. So if you had some basic parameters that the licensee then would feel comfortable, okay, the provider I selected to take the course from has demonstrated to me that they have this like minimum amount of knowledge or expertise. You know, if you had some set boundaries for it, then they would feel comfortable in taking that course and us accepting it.
Because if I think about this, when I look for coursework or whatever, I have the provider always has a little sort of fact sheet. We are this,
Yes.
we do that, we provide this kind of knowledge. The learning objectives are going to be this, so forth and so on. So that should be enough for the architect to make an intelligent decision on which,
And I think the issue
before they put
stemmed,
their money out.
I think the issue stemmed from some licensees going to a provider and felt that it wasn't adequate, that the person really didn't have expertise or
Yeah.
knowledge in it. But they chose that person. If they felt like it wasn't acceptable, they could have gone to somebody else. But that person might be misleading other licensees by thinking they're getting the fulfillment and the requirement. So I think there was this gray area that we're trying to hone in on some specific criteria for the licensees so that they have something to go by.
Okay. So let's take what we have in place now for providers, and I think what I'm hearing you say, Vicky, is that we need to amplify that a little bit.
I think that was the direction it was going, is if you could clarify some specific criteria for the provider and the coursework at a minimum, that would probably
So
be
if
that.
we could hear one more time what the provider requirements are now, and then maybe we can just add a couple words here or there to.
Sure, so right now the legislation is proposing that we adopt regulations to further define it so that we sort of have time to work it out rather than putting it into our statute, but it is, let's see if the page goes on, bear with me. Coursework provided shall be presented by trainers or educators with knowledge and expertise in these requirements. And so those are disability access requirements, including information and practical guidance concerning requirements imposed by the Americans with Disability Act, state laws that govern access to public facilities, and federal and state regulations adopted pursuant to those laws.
Okay. So we have to take the word accessibility out because we're not narrowing it down to that yet. So if our provider qualifications could be generally those with expertise and so forth, and we could maybe make this one subject to some sort of data collection of collateral organizations. What is it the AIA requires of their providers? We can look at that and see if we can amplify our requirements from that, or what does USGBC require, or anybody who requires collateral, CEs through providers. I think we can take
What's
that
the
information and
criteria?
build on it, right?
Yeah.
So can we do that? Can we say the provider qualifications shall be as currently stated, subject to comparative data collateral provider qualification requirements? That sound
I
good?
think so, yeah.
I agree.
That makes
Okay.
sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right.
So that's a motion.
Are we ready for a motion?
Might as well get
I
these
think
one at
we
a time.
Yep.
we already beat it to
Yeah.
at 5
Are we
minutes.
ready for a motion, somebody?
Yes,
Okay.
I'll make the motion.
What motion?
Exactly what is that?
So provider qualifications as is subject to this. How's that? Subject to comparative data on collaterals, provider requirements, right?
Provider requirements, not CE requirements.
Subject to collateral provider requirements. Does that make sense? Did I leave anything out?
Can I ask for a clarification? Are you suggesting that you want staff to do the research to determine and suggest qualifications based on this and then present that to the board?
I think what we're saying to the board is that our provider qualifications are, as they are now, subject to collateral provider, subject to data
Data from.
on collateral provider requirements.
Then who does what with the data?
Well, I think what happens, like the number of hours, the next step for this committee is to
Like how do the AIA
understand the data
provider?
that's collected by staff.
Do you want this to come back to the committee and
I
discuss it?
think, I don't know how else we can do it.
Okay.
So does that really mean then, whatever the requirements of a provider or coursework from these collateral organizations, you're gonna accept that as the basis of our requirements?
I think we're gonna make a decision based on what we,
What
the
we hear
information
from
we gain.
Yeah, how-
So you would get like
how-
a sampling of what those requirements are, and then look at it.
And then we'll
Okay.
sit through that and say, this looks good, this
See if
Because
there's any
we might have
commonality
already
between
done
them.
some of that research,
Yeah.
it might have already changed since we did it, but I think we did start that.
Okay?
Could we somewhat expand that? Are we discussing the motion right now?
Yeah, we're trying to shape a motion here.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the NCARB website. All but 5 states require continuing education for renewal or registration. It seems as though we could also look at what they're accepting as qualified providers in terms of continuing education. I can't imagine that they just pulled it out of the air and they don't have something, that's definitive. So
I think subject
still be under-
to
Yeah.
qualifications data from collateral provider requirements covers that, right?
Yeah,
does
We'll
it?
look at NCARB, we'll look at AIA, we'll look at,
yeah.
I want to look at other states.
we'll look at other
do that.
states, it's their collateral, right?
Well, they're not collateral organizations, so provider organizations, right?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a difference. Because they'd be looking at the same thing very likely.
Oh, okay. So when I say subject to qualification data from collateral provider,
Well, and
no,
that's,
drop that one
and
collateral?
other
I don't want to
states.
amend this.
I think we're focused on the providers here.
This is just providers here.
Right, but we're not focused on what other states are requiring of those collateral providers, if that's the way they qualify them
Okay.
for
Is there precedent
providing continued
for that?
education.
Right.
I'm not sure how to put it into
Yeah, I see what
words.
you're saying, though, I think.
You want to see what other states do?
Yes.
What do they require for their CE providers?
And literally, it's all but 5 have this requirement for renewal.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
A
how
lot
do
of
you
them probably rely on other organizations.
I
And just point it
imagine
out.
that too, and maybe they,
California has.
What if we said collateral / state boards?
that's good.
What's that?
Mr. Pasquale?
Blank.
Yes?
I was going to suggest, based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like the committee wants staff to research the requirements of collateral entities and other state boards and bring that information back for its consideration at its next meeting. And I would suggest that be the motion, and then, because that's what I'm hearing that you would like us to do. We have the parameters within which you want us to work. I'm just recommending to make it easier and for development of the motion. It's more broad, and then we know what your parameters are to narrow that information down for the committee. So I was just throwing that out there for the committee's consideration. A general motion of having staff research the requirements for collateral and entities and state boards, and then we'll give that information back, subject to that comparative analysis that the committee is requesting that we do.
Good. So can we have a motion that is inclusive of Part A and Part B? As we see it on the board?
Yeah.
I'll second Raymond's motion.
Yeah, I'll make the motion. No, seriously. I think part A is to look at the CE requirement and other collateral organization. Part B would be looking at how do they qualify the course providers from other states and from other organizations. And then after you get the data, you come back to this committee, and then we can look at it and say, well, it makes sense or it does not make sense.
Correct.
And I think is something that, based on what I see, would be the right thing to do at this point in time.
So I understand from B, as Marcus described, you want staff to do the research. Do you want staff to research A as well?
Yes.
Yeah,
so-
this
okay,
is like
same
the
type of thing.
engineers and
Okay.
the attorneys, and what are their requirements
Okay.
in California or in other states.
I think the purpose of it is to find out what would be palatable to the licensees, but also what would be palatable for the legislature to make, if we are to up the
To
number.
make it fly, to make it go through. Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Okay.
So that's a motion.
I'll
Somebody
second
make a
it.
motion.
I'll second.
Who made it?
I made the motion.
So Raymond made the motion.
I second it.
Well, you second, okay.
That's fine.
Okay, roll call.
Oops.
Vote.
Raymond Chang,
Yes.
Betsy Dougherty,
Yes.
Tien's gone, Glenn Gall,
Yes.
Oswald Gutierrez,
Yes.
Kirk Miller,
Yes.
Stephanie Silkwood,
Yes.
and Barry Williams, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Good deal.
Last time.
And we also have, as part of this, the recommendations from the committee to the board on topics. The staff will compile those topics that we voiced. Right, summarize
okay,
those and
that's
those will
what
go
we
to the, so we fulfilled what the committee's been asked to do today. All right. So,
So we did number one in the process.
so we've done 1, 2, and 3. We are now going to item 4. Okay, and item 4, which is review and amend California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Division 2, Article 3, Section 117, experience evaluation and related regulations to reflect current licensing requirements. And you all saw this in your packet. And what the committee is being asked to do is to discuss proposed regulatory amendments, consideration of additional degrees related to architecture, and provide staff with input regarding the table of equivalence. So again, trying to break this down into bite-sized topics that we can move systematically on. I propose that we do roundtable number 1, which is committee member commentary on additional degrees related to architecture. Then we'll go to round 2, which is committee member commentary on regulation amendments. And then round 3, which will be committee commentary on the table of equivalence. Okay? So round 1, let's begin round 1. So in order to begin round 1, I'm going to, on consideration of degrees, I'm going to refer you to, I think it's page 25 in your electronic version. I don't think it has a page
The
number.
one that says section 117 at the top, it's
And yeah, it's actually paragraph 5.
It's B5, degrees in a field related to architecture. It's
So it's past the
it's
table.
past the table, at the end of the table.
Okay, so down
On the
further.
next page.
Next page. Right there where it says degrees in field related.
Okay. So, as I understand it, this paragraph encompasses the various degrees that would be considered for credit. And I think legal counsel, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Marcus to introduce this topic and then we'll go from there.
So on this particular point, the issue that we have at present is that when an individual, a candidate, has a degree that is not listed in the section B5 or BB5, they don't receive any credit for that related degree because it's not listed there. The regulation as it currently is written is very prescriptive, and it has to be that degree and nothing else. So we looked at the language, and with Mr. Williams' assistance, he formulated some criteria. We brought that to our legal counsel because they needed to review this before the meeting, and they indicated to us that we must keep minimal subjectivity on any of the requirements that we spell out in our regulations. Their concern was that we would need to justify the reason why we chose a particular set of qualifications, what the standards were, why we chose that particular set of standards to be used. And they recommended against doing that and instead defining the majors that would be considered related degrees when a candidate applies. So the idea now, the suggestion now, would be to, instead of it saying defined in that section, described in that section, which leaves it so that if an individual has, instead of an architectural technology degree, it's architectural science and technology, they could receive the related credit. This would also reduce the subjectivity to a very low level, because it would be a matter of, if it's similarly described in the reg as the transcript reads, then it would be acceptable for related experience credit.
So what I'm hearing, Marcus, is on this paragraph 5B, on the second line, it begins with the word defined as the following, that we would amend the word defined to describe as the following.
Correct. That's a change.
That way there's some latitude, fairness, and equitability to make a decision on the actual degree.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's to the discretion of.
Yeah, who's the discretion?
Well, in other words, if it's, instead of it being dependent on there being a specific, instead of it being specifically architectural design, if it's architectural technology design,
Right.
the evaluator would know that it has architectural design in the title and could then give it credit.
So it's up to the evaluator to say, yeah, that seems similar enough to.
You know, the National
Still
Council of
seems-
Architectural Registration Board has this covered. You're either accredited or you're not.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what you call it. Just saying.
I think the issue right now, though, is if I gain a degree in architectural technology, I'm in, because it says architectural technology. If I procure a degree in architectural science and technology, I get no credit, because it only says architectural technology.
Here,
Here.
Yes.
but if NAAB has determined that whatever you want to call it, you know, the birds and the bees, meets all the criteria to be an accredited program of architecture, that determination is made by that body that is empowered to do that, to make that.
These are non-accredited degrees.
Yeah, these are.
These are all non-accredited. A5 is
Non-accredited.
non-accredited.
Yeah.
A1 is your accredited degree.
So by changing the word to describe as the following, it allows, okay, you have a degree in science and technology, okay, you're still in the arena.
So if you have a non-accredited degree, you pop into the 8-year program.
Well, maybe not.
Right? I mean,
But why
we
would you
have that.
why would your education vanish?
Why could you have the opportunity to call yourself an architect, and I happen to be on the California AIA Advisory Council right now to the political advocacy with Mark Christian, and we are back in it with the interior designers, and there's an interior design opportunity here. Interior architecture, environmental design, those are both some of the names of those programs. And as you know, we've been fighting with interior designers for 30 years.
I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that you still need 8 years of,
So if any of these people have the 8-year path, because our answer to them is, do your 8 years, that's your degree, and take the exam and become a licensed architect.
Well, that's still what they're doing.
Right, so why is this changing?
Isn't it about the credit though? How many years you get
Yes.
for these different
Yes.
things?
Right.
Candidates who
So-
are in these degree paths are afforded an additional year of experience rather than a base 1 year for having a degree. So we're saying these are more relevant, I guess, to the architectural profession and will therefore grant you more credit towards meeting the educational requirements.
So you get 1 more year toward your 8 years.
Yeah, so anybody, so for example, an English degree would get you 1 year,
Right.
an architectural technology degree would get you 2 years,
That's well.
and then it elevates from there.
Okay.
So a question for you now.
Victor, right?
If I understand it, under our pre-existing regulations, you could get your 8 years credit without any kind of education requirements if you were under a registered architect.
That's correct.
Now it's been changed, you don't do that unless you get a credit for those hours from some kind of higher education. Because
No,
unless such units have been transferred and accepted by a school.
no, Kirk, it doesn't
You can
change.
still start in the supply room and end up a licensed architect if you stay with the firm.
I'm sorry?
You can still start in the supply room and end up a licensed architect in California.
Well, that aside, but credit without a degree should only be computed within categories A through 5 of this section. No credit for these units under sections 6 through 8 shall be recognized unless such units have been transferred to and accepted by a school. So you wouldn't be able to get credit if you had 8 years without a higher education or working for an architect. If I'm reading this correctly.
That's referring to other,
Sorry?
this is, so that portion you're looking at is for multiple degrees. The A6 through 8, I believe,
Yes.
being renumbered.
Yes.
So that's saying that if you had a university degree that led you into like a NAB degree, you wouldn't get credit for the original university degree in addition to the NAB degree.
No, I understand. I'm not.
That's what
quibbling
that's
about- I'm not quibbling
specifically
about- I'm looking at the second sentence. No credit for units under sections 6 and 8, which is included the 6 to 8. Excuse me, I misread this. So we're looking at. I'm looking particularly under 10.
yeah.
Okay, so I stand corrected.
So Kirk, if I
stand
can,
corrected.
we can do that in round 3, which is the
Yeah.
table of equivalents.
I misunderstood that. My fault. My bad.
So we're focusing on
Right.
the
Yes, I got it.
non-accredited schools.
My bad. Okay.
I just had a comment for Marcus. If we change that define to describe, was that recommended by legal? Was that their solution to help do this, or is this something that we just came up with?
It's a solution that we've come up with. It would still need to be run through legal, but it simplifies the process because there's literally probably hundreds of different degrees out there, names for degrees. And it would be a daunting task for the committee to try and define all those. What specifically what legal requested is that the committee consider only listing the majors, not doing anything with regard to requirements to be considered a related field, because that carried too much subjectivity with it. Legal counsel's concern was that the person making the decision, the evaluator, would have to look at, well, number one, it would be what standard would we be using? Whose standard is it? That was their main concern, is because...
I understand the rationale behind
Okay.
it, but I think that if you change that word to describe, it might not make it through the Office of Administrative Law, because how would you define that? It still would be subjectivity to it. So
It seems like it would become more subjective
Yeah.
if you just said describe.
I mean, we could ask legal for input on it, but
Right.
I think that it would not make it through the way out.
I think the issue is, how do we have this paragraph in place that doesn't limit it to just those degrees listed? Because if it limits it to just those degrees listed, there has to be a wholesale collection of every degree in the state.
Right.
in order for it to
And they
be
change
qualified.
too.
And they change all the time.
They rename them and they have different requirements for the curriculum. Yeah,
So we
it's-
can have some
it's all-
sort of means and fairness and equity that if you have a degree, not just in architectural technology, but architectural science and technology, that it still qualifies, so you're eligible for
Well,
credit.
originally we had proposed to legal, and I don't know how it was presented, but we had proposed something where, maybe it had a core amount of curriculum in the degree program, and that as long as it met that minimum amount, we didn't care what you called it, the degree program. But I think legal had an issue with that.
Yeah, they
when
shut
we
that
had
down.
proposed that, because we thought, well, we could look at the curriculum, see if there's like an average of it, and then, define that in the regulation. But I think she thought that would be problematic as well.
And right now, what we're proposing, the reason we're proposing, as described, we realize that there could, one, this will go, if the committee agrees to that change on here, this language is going to go back to legal for their input. If there's a problem with it, we will definitely be bringing the language back to the committee with any additional, we're going to explain the rationale to legal about why we suggested described as opposed to defined, and see whether that's something they would be okay with. Given the current process, if for reg changes, if there's a problem with the language, it's going to probably get caught long before it gets to OAL in the first place. So we'll know fairly soon after the committee votes and we send it off to legal whether there's an issue, and then we can, at that time, perhaps bring it to the board for additional input, or bring it back to the committee.
If you're thinking about bringing it back to the committee to discuss any changes legal makes, which presumably they'll make changes, just think about the time that's adding on. Because right now it's about 2 years from when the board votes to start rulemaking to when the regulations are adopted. And we're not, so then if we want to wait for another committee meeting, they don't have to go to another board meeting, it's probably adding a year on to that 2 years, so.
I
Mind.
personally agree with the intent of what's written and that it can be loosely interpreted, and I think the question will come up is whose decision, whose interpretation, and if there's an appeal process, if the evaluator doesn't rule in somebody's favor.
And the only way we could get away from that, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but is to have every single architectural degree listed that's currently in the state and revise it every year.
Landscape recently tried to do this. They expanded their pathways, and it was interesting. There were some educators, they had like a subgroup that did it, but there was educators in that group. And it was interesting, like they came up with like a list of degrees that aren't real common, but would fall, as a related degree. And then there would be difference of opinions. No, it's not named that, it's named this. I mean, it was all over the place. So they ultimately ended up leaving it the way it was. I think they added maybe 1 or 2 pretty standard degrees. So I think what legal recommended, and Marcus might remember this better than me, but I think she recommended, look at your list. Is there anything that jumps out that's not on here? Add it on here, and then periodically review it and update it. And not have any criteria that it has to meet. Just periodically review it and add degrees on there that you think are pretty standard that you're not covering in the wording.
So-
I know over the past few years, we've had some candidates come to us with some unique degrees, maybe not common degrees, and we've looked at the curriculum to see how comparable it was, and they were very comparable. So
How do we get that comparability to be there, though? Because my understanding is that if you have a degree in, it's stated here, architectural technology, but if my degree shows up as architectural science and technology, what do I have to do to
you
get
look at
credit?
the coursework and the reviews.
Will that happen?
Well,
That's
that's
subjective,
what
too.
we had been doing.
Is it possible to list that here?
No, I think
As an
legal
alternate
recommended.
in addition to?
I think legal recommended that.
Yeah, I can add on that. So, the idea of having, if a candidate, based on the information we have from legal now, if a candidate were to say, well, I have the architectural science and technology degree, I feel it's the same. As legal is saying it, nope, you don't have architectural technology, no. Because they don't want us sending it off to an educator like we used to for them to use the curriculum, because it runs into that very same issue with what curriculum are they using? What school did they use? Why did they use that school? Why didn't they use other schools? Is there a national standard? Why didn't they use the national standard? And this is all to create that equity for candidates, because what you could run into is if you go to one school, yes, that meets the requirement, but another school could also have an architectural science and technology degree, but its criteria doesn't meet it. And then another point that legal counsel brought up was how frequently would we be reviewing these criteria to make sure they're up to date. So they did mention LETC's effort to try and resolve this issue, and there is the solution, one possible option for a solution, of just leaving it as it is. And then periodically, I mean, through data that we can collect information. When we get a request like this, we could collect how often that's happening, what kind of degrees they were, bring that back to the committee for its consideration in the future of, okay, maybe we can add these majors. Legal doesn't seem to have a problem with us picking majors. They seem to have a problem when it comes to using the criteria and the rationale for why a particular set of criteria was being used.
So, but if the degree is listed here, and if the degree that a candidate is successful in completing is not verbatim the title of this degree, they are subject to no credit, correct?
They would not get the 2 years credit. They could get a year's credit.
Okay.
So it's not as if it would negate it. It's just they wouldn't be able to receive the additional year.
Yeah, but what kind of an argument and lack of equity does that raise when someone is, just because there's a word different to the degree name?
I completely understand the committee's.
Well, I think too, I mean, one thing about the NAB requirements, there's a specific amount of, coursework that you have to do, et cetera, to meet the NAB requirements.
Right.
And then you look at these and you go, okay, I'm going to get a degree in architectural design from school A and I'm going to get one from school B. They could be totally different criteria.
That's what she's saying.
Yeah, that's exactly what she's saying.
And when you compare another one to one of those, why did you pick that one over the other one?
So it seems like this list has all sorts of problems with it. Just the list itself.
Either we have to say, I think we have to say it's either generally or described as, or generally defined as, or list them and say in alignment with some sort of standard we point to.
Well, when Marcus went to legal, it was, she just did a fairly quick review of it. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time, so we could go back to legal and see what she might be comfortable with and maybe try to expand it.
Yeah.
But from her first advice, it was look at the list, see if it's missing anything right now, and periodically review it and assess it. But we could go back to her and see if we could come up with something.
I think we have to, my comment anyway, it's just mine, is that we need to send this paragraph back to legal and say, this is not fair and equitable for candidates, that perhaps it's just too prescriptive on the degree title. And there's no latitude there for architectural science and technology versus just architectural technology.
Are you reading and applying your own regs that discreetly?
We have to.
Yeah, we have to.
As a regulation?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's defining.
It's saying this is what a related field is, and it has to be that. Again,
not by the discrete term. I mean, the way this language is put, it doesn't say label this title of degree. I mean, you still have to go through an assessment of it. because we're not pointing to any standard criteria. These are general.
We could ask legal if it could be interpreted that way, but that's not how we.
Yeah, that's not how legal has interpreted it in the past. They've interpreted it as it has to be these specific, like electrical engineering, structural engineering, mechanical, it has to be worded that way.
See the
We
issue?
tried to do,
Yeah, but it seems like you're over applying your regulation. I mean, when it says defined as the following, it doesn't say named the following. I mean, these are general categories of degree. It's about the way you're applying your own regulation.
legal's interpretation of defined is, it's a limitation that when you say something is defined as, you're limiting it to that definition, and that's what she used as, that's because I tried to go through the idea of, well, could it say defined as this or with a curriculum similar to, or we tried a few different ways of where we were like similarly, and it was rejected.
But we can double check.
But we can
I also
work with
heard
them
from a
to see-
lawyer who looked at regulations that the law is not black and white. It's a series of gray.
Yes.
And frankly, you need to talk to your lawyer about what series of gray you're looking for in this context. I mean, that's such a strict read of the regulation. It's hard to believe that that's the only read that you can make of this regulation.
We can go back to them with that. Like I said, that's the take that they have now. We can definitely express to them the committee's concern. They will ultimately review it, and then it will pass on to the various control agencies for their interpretation. So it'll run through the.
Just to ask legal to double
No,
check.
yeah.
No. I'm talking about after it's
OAL will
done,
be
yeah.
the final word.
you know-
They get cuckoo sometimes.
And you know
too.
what it might, what they probably would do, legal counsel would probably do is look at the intent of the regulation package that established
And that's my
that wording.
point.
And I think at the time, that wording came from names of degrees, but we'll double check it and
Yes.
see what she says.
So just
Kurt,
to
first,
reinforce
then Barry.
what Glenn is saying, he's absolutely right. You know, so the levels of regulation, first of all, you have legislation, you have, and there's certain gray, it's almost black and white, but there's a gray area underneath. So you clear up that gray area by establishing rules and regulations that are within the nature of the legislation.
Correct.
But then there's also some gray area underneath that, which comes in the form of policy associated to those regulations. And there are two types of policies. There's one that's called a soft policy, which is verbal, and everyone has an understanding of it, but it's not in writing. Then you have hard policies, which are in writing, that further define the regulations. So what Glenn is saying is if you word the regulation correctly, there's some interpretation covered by policy, which is up to you all as staff. Is that
Well,
not what you're saying?
Right, and it allows a little bit more flexibility in that sort of an application of this language in this regulation.
Yeah, so policy is considered by OAL an underground regulation that is prohibited. So
By what is it?
it's considered an underground regulation.
By
So
whom?
By OAL, the Office of
Policy is
Administrative
It's like
Interpretation
interpretation
maybe.
This is important because it has to do with building codes as well.
So if we have, so the regulation says it's defined as this.
Yes.
If we had a soft policy,
Yes.
that would be considered an underground regulation.
By whom?
By Office of Administrative Law. Those would be that would be the entity that approves regulations. And so there's a prohibition on underground regulations. That's why the regulations, so you have the statute, then within the statute, you're either given authority or not given authority to promulgate regulations. Those regulations have to provide the clarity of the statute. So where it happens with OAL sometimes is it's too vague, it's too broad. You have to narrow it, make it more specific. So in order for it to be clear, because the regulation which clarifies the law is supposed to make it easier for the person who reads the law to know what exactly is the requirement of the law. And so having an underground regulation, okay, a good example is if you have a regulation that deals with enforcement of the Practice Act, and then you have a procedure of various outcomes, that can be considered an underground regulation. And I know Department of Insurance ran into that situation where they had a multi-page policy of how they take care of various types of cases, and they were told that's an underground regulation.
Mark, I really appreciate this, and so I guess what I need to find out is the Office of Administrative Law, whether that's statewide for all regulations, because I've had
It is. It's
I've had
state
a dispute
Except
with
for
the city.
building standards.
Well, sure, thank you. No, because I've had a problem
I'm
with the
serious.
city of Oakland, who have a policy that's contrary to the laws, let alone regulations. And Pascal, I'm not sure whether you showed it, government to this as construction administration, maybe because why are building codes exempt?
Building standards go to the Building Standards Commission and don't go to OAL.
Darn.
They do a 3-year cycle to approve the building codes, right? So, but, I mean, I think you would still have an issue if a local jurisdiction develops something that
Right.
contradicts the state building code,
And
but. you would
That's
do
what
the
I'm getting
building
at. Even if you still have interpretive authority within the agency that can interpret this on the softer side rather than, I just, when it says related to architecture, the hell's that? Excuse me, I'm sorry.
I understand what you're saying, and I think, and what Marcus is saying is accurate, is that the regulations are supposed to be what we operate under, and we're not supposed to have policy underneath that. That's not really, it's not flexible, and
Wow.
certainly lots of programs operate with underground regulations and get away with it until they're challenged. But we've already asked legal about this. We've gotten an opinion. Legal is going to give us advice and tell us, give us their best advice on how we operate. But I'm not sure that we're going to have the flexibility to do it any differently. But it's certainly worth checking into.
And I will most certainly take the committee's concerns back to legal and say, this is what the committee is looking for. This is the direction we want to go, and ask them, how can they word craft this for us so that it will work?
Yeah.
Because I know that legal can provide us that kind of direction. What we're seeking, what we were hoping to do, ideally, of course, is to have the committee look at what could potentially be additional content. I think, as I understand the discussion, the committee would want us to go back to legal now, provide this concern, and see how much latitude there is in the term defined, and then suggest with described or something similar. And am I correct in what I'm understanding
Yes.
from the committee's desires to be?
Yeah, can I do a motion? I can do a motion, can I?
No, your chair.
Your
Well,
chair.
I'm the chair. You want to do a motion?
Sure, check the motion.
That's a conflict of interest.
Okay, so the motion is for paragraph 5B that we feel is too descriptive and needs to, and we
Prescriptive.
too prescriptive and needs to be recommended amendment to provide equity of degrees related to architecture. Is that nice and clear?
We don't think that the paragraph is fair.
Could I just say one little? How often does this come up in a percentage of candidates? Is this something that we're
A very small percentage.
It's a small
I think-
percentage,
Okay.
but we don't want to be as prescriptive as
Okay.
we have.
But we don't know how many we're turning away, though,
Yeah.
that don't know.
They don't know
you
that's it. They don't even know
These are
that's
the
an
ones we know
opportunity.
about, yeah.
These
These
are
are the ones
the
we
ones
know
who
about.
contact us after.
I will
Okay.
second the motion if I understood it correctly. No, Marcus, so
Sure.
often this is the type of lawyer you have. There's some lawyers who are deal makers and there's some lawyers who are deal breakers. So we need to find a lawyer. This lawyer hopefully will do something that protects the health, safety, and welfare, but doesn't hamstring the protectors of the health, safety, and welfare so that they get a minor change. They got to run it all the way up to food chain to the legislature. There's got to be some flexibility to you all to do your job.
We may also look and see how other boards handle this. I don't know if we looked at other regulations to see if there's a model out there.
We can definitely look into that.
We don't want to hamstring you. I mean,
So
our candidates.
we do have a motion and we do have a second. The motion was made by Barry Williams, and the motion was stated that paragraph 5B is too prescriptive. It needs recommended amendment to provide equity of degrees related to architecture. The motion was seconded by Kirk Miller. And we'll take a straw vote because we have two more things to discuss on this agenda item. So by straw vote,
Oh, so this isn't the vote?
no, that's not the motion.
No.
We have to create a motion at the end for this whole agenda
Okay.
item.
Okay.
So this is like our part A,
Would you
part
like-
B. So this
would you
is
raise your
part,
hand?
part A. Yeah, so let's take a straw vote.
Oh, do you want to actually vote? Okay.
Oh, we can do it. We can do it. Yeah, it's a straw vote. How many are in favor of that part of the motion?
Aye.
Okay, so straw vote tells us we can move on to the
Okay.
next round. The next round is committee member commentary on regulatory amendments. These items are the ones that were coordinated between DCA and Legal Affairs. That's what this committee was asked to comment on. So, and we see red and blue all over the place here. So does anybody have any, staying away from the table of equivalents because that's our final round.
Oh.
Do we see anything in the other language that,
I have a very, very quick question, if I'm not mistaken again, which I apologize for that earlier error. Under the list of, and I'm not going to get, it's not going to be changed, I'm sure, but just more of a question. A10, I think it is, which is 8 years credit for working under a revision of an architect. Throughout all these equivalencies, there's a recognition that Canada and the United States are very closely tied together. And part of that came from the old North American Free Trade Agreement, because I brought interns from Canada down, and they get across the line and get their visa and so forth and so on. And there's reciprocity between Canada and the United States. Canada recognizes NCARB certificates for reciprocity, and so it's sort of a mutual love affair, except for 10, where candidates don't get any credit for working under a licensed Canadian architect.
That would be covered under experience under a foreign licensed architect.
Which number is that?
14, I believe.
14.
Experience as or experience obtained under the direct supervision. Oh, sorry, not 14. No, it's one of the last ones.
Number 11, I think, or 12 now.
19.
Yes.
Experience as a foreign, or 18.
Oh.
Sorry. 18 and 19 are
Oh,
foreign experience, and Canada experience falls under that.
Oh, so 50%,
We granted it 50% credit.
Very last one, okay.
18.
We require 1 year under a U.S. architect. For all of our licensees, it's 1 year under a U.S. architect or 2 years essentially under a Canadian architect for licensure.
I'm looking at 18, it says 7 years, that means one would have to work for 14 years for Canadian architect?
No, no,
That's the maximum.
that's the maximum they could get is 7 years of credit.
Okay.
So,
But,
Maybe I misunderstood.
well, yeah, well, I guess what I'm trying to, so what if someone had a degree from an accredited school, you get first, all credit for that, as I understand it.
Correct.
And then, so where would you get teaching or accredited NK or accredited architecture programs? So I'm understanding if you work in Canada for 3 more years under Canadian architect, would you be able to get licensed in the States or in California? So where is the, you're saying 17 I should look at?
17 is experience under the direct supervision of an architect licensed in
Or Canada?
Or 18,
Only for
sorry,
the
yeah.
hours work.
18.
So you get 1 year.
No, it's 18.
I'm sorry.
It's 18. It's experience under the direct supervision of an architect licensed in a qualifying foreign country, Canada being a qualifying foreign country.
Right.
The 7 years, if I misunderstood, yes, you basically would be working 14 years. If you're using just experience, just work experience, you would work 14 years. You would be credited a maximum of 7.
Got it.
And then you would have to work 1 year under a U.S. architect, and that's covered in one of the other sections beneath the table.
That's solely without any education. If you were
That's
going
solely
that
without,
path.
yes. With education, if you had a Cat B degree, that would be 5 years. Then you'd need to work 4 more years to get the remaining 2. and then you'd have to work, and that's under foreign, that's Canadian. Then you'd have to work 1 more year under a U.S. architect for the 8.
Our provision allows 1 year under U.S. or 2 years under Canadian.
Okay, so you could work two more
So you
years.
could
You
work-
could work 2 more years under Canadian. So you could work a total of 6 years under the
Canadian.
Canadian.
You don't need 4 years Canadian because 50% credit?
Yes, it would be the CACB degree and then 6 years
Yeah.
Canadian.
And you
Or-
can also do the Canadian.
Lots of ways.
And IAP, yes. So
Right, you could do
essentially,
IAP.
you could do the CACB degree and IAP, and that would meet all of our requirements.
Okay, or under what I'm talking about, the intern who has a degree can come down and work for me in the States, and then they get a year's equivalent because they're working under me in the States.
Right.
Yes.
And they probably get 100% credit for that in Canada. Okay, good, fair enough. We're treating Canadians properly, I'm glad to hear that.
Glenn, any comments?
No comments.
Raymond?
Actually, I do have a
Yes.
question though. I went through this stuff and my eyes started to go like this a little bit. Do you guys perceive any really, really substantive changes in here? Because a lot of them to me look like clarifications, a little bit of reorganization.
There are some substantive changes.
Could you point those out?
Yes.
Like highlight, high level?
Work while in school,
Oh, yeah.
we limit currently. We'd like to expand that to remove the limitation. Allowing work under collateral licenses to count for the initial ARE eligibility. It's currently allowed when candidates use AXP records to become eligible for the ARE. It makes sense to allow it for everybody. And I think those were the big ones off the top of my head.
Well, I think there's
That
one more.
and doing the degrees, those were the really major ones.
Question,
The
Paul,
rest
yeah,
of it was,
this-
yeah.
We looked at
pretty
this, I think it was
non-substantive.
maybe 2 meetings ago or whatever, and that was the integrated program where the
I was just gonna ask about that.
internship is integrated with the education.
Yes.
And
You
I was
start
al-
taking
I
your
was
exam
always-
while you're in school.
Yeah, I always assumed that the way that should be set up is that you still need a total of 8 years to get your license. But I understand that somehow they're integrating and you get with less than 8 years, and how in the heck do you do that without shortchanging somewhere along the line?
Do you mean IPAL?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Integrated.
So what they're doing, the way that we will be eventually interpreting this as, is you get the NAB accredited degree
Yes.
and completion of AXP. Because that will be...
AXP being an internship.
Yes, the
3 years.
internship.
But
So
how many
those
years
two
does it
things-
take to do what you do combined?
It varies on the program and the individual. So there are people who may not complete AXP as part of the IPAL program, so it could go longer than the program goes.
May I
But-
rephrase the question? What is the minimum amount of time in any of these programs it would take to get your degree and your experience?
6 years.
6 years.
6 years.
Not 8.
What
And
where are you not
also you can be
shortchanged by
taking your
not having those
exam.
other 2 years?
So, to clarify on that, if you do AXP, you get 3 years. Minimum 3, maximum of 5. If you get your degree from these accredited programs, you have 5 years. So it's an equivalency. So you have the equivalency of 8 years. Time-wise, it may take 6 years, but you've earned 5 years of equivalency from a degree program and 3 additional years from doing the internship portion. So that's how it's not calendar years, but it's equivalency of experience
They're
years.
done at the same time instead of linear at the end.
No, I appreciate
It
that.
kind of goes back to the whole philosophy behind our CIDP. It's knowledge-based, not time-based.
So the theory is then that by having the two together, your education is more quote unquote productive because you've got some practical experience either before that portion of the education or concurrent with that education. Therefore, you're absorbing more in the education process, and then also perhaps because I don't know how you could be earning more in the internship process, because if you already have a 5-year degree and start your internship, you'd have just as much knowledge as your. So I appreciate the intent of it for sure, but I still don't quite understand what happened to the extra 2 years. Are you like a lawyer that's billing more than 24 hours a day?
No, they're still completing the time, it's just that it's done at the same time. So maybe some of their units are part of their curriculum, is working with a firm in their local area, and they're getting work experience at the same time, and they're completing their AXP.
Yeah, but you'd have less time to work in studios because you wouldn't be awake
They're
24
still
hours a day.
fulfilling the
Yeah,
curriculum.
I think you go back and look at the title of the IPAL program, Integrated Path to
Yeah,
Architectural
no, I
Licenses.
appreciate that.
It's just integrated, it's still the same amount, it's weaved together.
So you're going on one path. So
Yeah.
the traditional way it was done was it was all consecutive. You did, because if you remember, we had like the 6 different ways you could enter into then IDP. So the person was going through school, then they were doing the AXP or the IDP, and once they had completed school or the equivalent, then they were able to test. So now, and that's why graphical expression of this is much more difficult now than it was then in say the older handbooks, because over the years NCARB has made everything basically concurrent. I think it's been about 10 years that they've allowed candidates to do AXP from right at graduation from high school at 18 on, and that took them. That came out in a series of changes. You know, first they had the 3 levels, you know, at which you could do it, and then they completely eliminated it. So, in essence, it's been that way for a while, and that's what when staff was asked how would IPAL affect this. That's why we reported that we're already pretty much doing it because candidates were starting their AXP much earlier than they had been before.
And I think
I'm going to move this along a little bit because some people have to leave earlier than others. So I'm going to switch over to Stephanie.
I was just going to say, this committee has already approved the support of the IPAL process.
Oh, yeah.
So now it's just making sure that this table catches up with that, right?
Yes.
So where does this catch
And
up
that's what
with?
some of the changes do that Tim's
So it's
described.
not self-evident.
The changes that we're making
Well, I
are
think
things we've already discussed for several years now, right?
Correct.
Yeah, we're behind on getting this table
Yes.
on board with everything else we're doing.
Is this table now on board?
That's the
It's
right
a
question.
proposal. It's a proposal.
That-
So if you have an accredited degree of 5 years, you still need 3 years experience, but it's somehow absorbed within the 5 years. So how does that table
That's
work
only
out?
for your IPAL. Only for your IPAL.
Yeah.
Well, the
It's an
internship
IPAL.
counts now during school.
Right.
That's the addition.
So
The
you could
internship
do it.
comes during
It's
school,
possible.
so now,
Right.
as you're
See-
going to school and
Yeah.
like through summers, et cetera, all that's being added together.
I understand that,
And
but,
so-
but how is that in here where you take 8 years under the old criteria and you can now do it in 6? How's that expressed in this table of equivalencies?
So that would be, looking at the table itself, it would be A1,
A1,
which
5-year
is the
degree.
professional degree from NAB, and A11, certification upon completion of, oh no, that's the blue cover. 12.
A12?
So A1 and A12.
Just a second. 8, 12, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is for 8 years. 11.
Kirk, while you're reviewing that, I'm going to move along. And
Got it.
So, any other comments, Stephanie?
There we are. Okay, got it. 8 years, but it says 8 years.
That
Well-
is to allow the board to afford candidates who report all of their experience to AXP, to allow us to accept their AXP record to count for everything.
These are
So,
maximums.
so I'm
These are
really seeing
maximums.
some synergy here, which is supposed to be.
Yes.
So you spend 6 years in school and internship combined, and you get 8 years equivalency. That's very good synergy.
Well, no. These are the what's proposed. These are maximums. The maximum credit one could get for just submitting AXP is 8 years. You get what you've actually earned. Right now, under the current structure, you would get a maximum of 5 years. You get a minimum of 3, but a maximum of 5. And there are inequities that arise from that. There's barriers that are created for people who don't have an accredited degree. So the proposal of allowing the maximum credit to go to 8 would mean that if a person has reported all of their time for AXP, that's great. They can get credit for it in entirety. With the IPAL, what you have is the 5 years under A1, and then under A12, you have 3 years of credit that you would receive. Because you only receive what you need to get to 8. So if you've already got 5 from the A1, you only need 3 under this category. But the numbers that are listed in the far right column, those are just the maximum. Those are the maximum amounts you could receive under that particular category.
Excuse me, Pascal. Okay, so this maybe you as staff have a great deal of discretion as to how to interpret what you get from the schools that offer the AXP program then.
No.
No.
No, they either they complete AXP or they don't.
Yeah,
They
the
go through
supervisor
NCAR to
guidelines,
complete it.
NCAR criteria.
Okay, well, we can talk this offline.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I want to go to Raymond, because I think you need to leave the next
Yeah.
earliest.
Okay.
Any comments?
No, that's fine.
No comments for Raymond. Okay, so then back on the trail, so we've got Raymond. How about Betsy?
I think this is as clear as mud.
Okay, great. Clear as mud. Okay.
It's way better.
That's about it? Is that anything else?
That's it.
That's it, okay, clear as mud. Very good. Barry, any comments?
No, I'm fine.
No, okay. So, and I don't have any additional comments. So the only motion that I think that has come from our review of agenda item number 4 is the one that Barry proposed and Kirk second.
To B5?
5, yeah,
Five.
that paragraph 5B is too prescriptive and needs recommended amendment to provide equity of degrees related to architecture.
So we're to work with legal to come up
Work
with
with legal.
I think.
And I wanted to clarify with the committee members. So what the intent of the motion to do is revise the language to make it more equitable for candidates.
Well, I think we want to hear from legal how it can be revised so that it's fair and equitable, and it's not just restricted to these degree names.
And we're gonna check and see what other professions, if they're wording in their regulations.
Right, yeah, we've got that
So
down.
bottom line is, so how does the legal word it so that you have a little bit of flexibility for interpretation that's not threatening the health, safety, and welfare?
Okay.
Roll call vote, please.
We'll call a vote. Raymond Chang.
Yes.
Do you want it to come back to the committee or?
Leave it up.
I think we leave it up to the
Leave it
board,
staff.
don't we? No, we leave it up
Or
to the board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right again. Raymond Chang.
Yes.
Still yes, okay. Betsy Dowery.
Yes.
Tiancon. Glenn.
Yes.
Pascual Gutierrez.
Yes.
Kirk Miller.
Yes, with Betsy's understanding, some of it's as clear as mud.
Stephanie Silkwood.
Yes.
That's why we're doing.
And Barry Williams, yes. Passes. 7-0.
Okay, so the motion is passed.
Can I
And-
make one more comment before we move on? I
Sure.
just wanted to note that I think the title, Table of Equivalents, is very confusing to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So now might be the opportunity to consider something that's more descriptive. So when you say, look at the Table of Equivalents, people don't go, what? The what? Even if it's just like Table of Experience Equivalent,
Yeah.
or something like that might clarify.
Can staff take that under advisement and?
Oh, yes.
And make a recommendation? Okay, great. So that takes us to agenda item F, from which we do not need a motion. And this meeting of the Professional Qualifications Committee on April 18th is now adjourned.
Thank you.
All right, thank you,
Good job,
everybody.
Pascual.
Safe travels home.